And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. It's great to be here. It's a fantastic crowd already. Of course, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia's been really tracking all the crazy astral stuff that's been going on.
And will continue to go on all through the year.
And what do you make of that?
It's the end of, well, the overall, if I could sum it up, it's the end of the patriarchy. Coming into the true age of Aquarius. So there are good things coming, but we are in the death throes of the patriarchy.
It's really interesting. There's a lot of interpretations going on about astrology. Anyone I know who does anything with astrology is absolutely beside themselves with the aspects for this year, good and bad. But there's no doubt there's something significant going on in that department. We also be hearing a lot about a super conjunction, which is something that's going to be happening. And so spring, summer, winter, fall, we're seeing all of them. It's
the Saturn-Pluto conjunction that is happening on the 12th.
Yes, so that's one. Yes. That's a biggie. But
that is the huge thing.
It is. There's a pretty major one. The one I read about is April 7th. And that's pretty heavy duty. And then at the end of the year, there's supposedly this prediction by an astrologer for December 20th, 2020. So you're going to be looking at all this stuff all year long. Now, but tonight, we're not looking at astrology. We're going to be looking at Deep State X-Operatives in this X series episode 77. Now, this is a particularly significant time for us to be looking at this, given what's been going on with Iran and the current administration's kind of reckless attitude towards Iran that's been happening. And, preceded by the other party's reckless attempt to remove him from office on very flimsy charges in the House. So we have now both parties acting out of bounds, and because they're acting out of bounds, things around the world are slipping through our fingers. And this is very much the chaos that the deep state thrives in. And of course, just a quick reminder about the deep state, which is that this is a term that really came together in the public consciousness, put forward by Professor Peter Dale Scott, who's no stranger to this program. He's been on here and we've spoken many times. But he coined the term in America because there was something that happened in Turkey, and it was a political sensation. And what happened was there was the leading person of the drug cartel over there. And there was another person who was the kind of leading law enforcement officer. And then there was a major person from Turkish parliament. And then there was a beauty queen. And they all were found in the same car accident. So this combination of factors, the term in Turkish translated to something akin to deep state. And that's where Professor Scott used it and applied it across the board. Now, he'd already used the term deep politics. And really, when we see it kicked around in our lexicon all about the deep state, a lot of the people using it don't actually know what they're talking about. So, when you see a lot of these channels spewing things about, like, don't worry about the bombing we did in Iran because we're hitting deep state targets. That's not how it works. The deep state is inside. This is the whole problem. It's inside our government. And it runs parallel alongside our government and moves in when it needs a policy change. And then when it moves out, it leaves all this destruction. So you're not going to be bombing deep state targets in Iran. That's foolishness that we've been hearing a lot about in the independent media. And then in the mainstream media, for a long time, they like to pretend that the deep state didn't exist. And then they try to defang the term once it got into some kind of regular use, because it was actually Breitbart that had picked up the term and was starting to use it. And it was coming largely through people like Steve Bannon, who were probably aware of the work of somebody like Professor Scott. And so this whole thing happened. So they defanged it to just mean some leftover people, like might as well have worked at the registry of motor vehicles or something. And so this is a totally different thing. The deep state, according to Professor Scott, and it's available in 3 different or 4 different interviews I've done with him. He's always defined it in the interviews. He describes it as a system that, coalesces for a purpose, uses it runs sort of parallel the normal law and order traditional government that we know. Vote, pay your taxes, all those types of things. It's this other version of the government. And there are forces there that run through intelligence, the management of finance, the contracting agencies that intelligence agencies will use, and political figures and organized crime. That's some kind of cross-section of the deep state. And it is these forces moving to get a policy change. It's when they unite and when they use systems that are set up, that are in the government, that they exploit. And they get together to do this, and then they're able to cause things, and we've seen all these deep events. Now, deep events, according to Professor Scott, would be the JFK assassination is a deep event, where a series of agencies and forces coalesce to remove a president because they want a policy shift. And more. If you watch this program, it goes even deeper than that. We could say something like Watergate is a deep event. That's one that Professor Scott would list there. The Iran-Contra affair, where they were using these continuity of government channels. People like Oliver North were using what would be our emergency nuclear communication channels in order to do these arms deals so that nobody could, for example, intercept the phone call. Things of this nature. What they call the October surprise, where Bush and Casey in 1980 went over and tried to negotiate arms deals with the Iranians. Interestingly enough, at that point we were giving them arms. Right now they're supposedly the worst thing in the world, and in order for them to hold off on giving back the hostages until Reagan got installed. So that was the October surprise, and that was supposed to help boot out Jimmy Carter. I don't think they needed a whole lot of help from that department, frankly. Especially, he had collapsed during a marathon or one, so it wasn't very presidential looking. But then we could look at other incidents, like as we go forward, 9/11, of course, the deep event of deep events with the JFK assassination. Those two bookends kind of define everything in between. Other versions of it would be like BCCI and some of these other real kind of financial scandals. And the 2008 crash, no question, the deep state is very involved in all the things that happened there. So at times, the idea of the deep state can be likened to an iceberg, which is we can see the top point of it and everything underneath it. We can't see so well, but there's a large structure under there, and we just get to see that top piece. That's kind of a good definition, although when I ran that by Professor Scott, he said something about how it's more like a system and don't think of it so much as a structure. So that's something we need to keep in mind as we do this. Now, tonight we're going to have some very, very interesting examples and put things on the record that have not been on the record and combine them. But we're going to do this macrocosm, microcosm thing. So on the microcosm side, we'll get into someone like Thomas Valley, who was an assassin that was set up to do all these things and be like a Lee Harvey Oswald, but at the last minute they sort of yanked him and they installed Oswald instead. Or John Hinckley Jr., for example, who attempted to assassinate President Reagan, and who, by the way, is out now.
Since how long?
And within the last 9 months.
Interesting.
I know. And you wouldn't think of it. It's like, Sirhan and people like that, they wouldn't let out. But Hinckley, somehow he got out. We have to remember Hinckley comes from a very powerful Bush-connected family, and that, in fact, his dad was going to meet Bush Sr. 2 nights after the Reagan assassination. That's how close those families were. So we're going to get into all that, and we're going to piece together some of these assassinations. Then on the large scale side, we're going to look at continuity of government and the players involved with that. And continuity of government is something that's stripping us right now as we speak of a normal constitutional government. So these things are very important to keep in mind. I have to say before we even start that a lot of the work involved around this, a lot of the credit for opening up so many of the doors of this goes to Professor Peter Dale Scott, and his own influence on my thinking politically has to be the most profound. And his best book, I believe, is it's so good it's not even here. It's American Deep State. Oh, there it is. And it's a remarkable book, and it's amazing to me too because
Isn't that really hard to get a hold of nowadays?
well, that's what I hear, but I think if you make a dedicated effort, you can find it. American Deep State. There it is. Quite a remarkable book, and the subtitle: Wall Street, Big Oil, and the Attack on U.S. Democracy. Professor Peter Dale Scott. Actually, he's one of the only people I've seen emphasize continuity of government. And he was a Canadian diplomat. And then he became a professor, which he is now retired, a UC Berkeley professor. And he was there for some 3 decades. And now he is still writing at the age of 89. So quite a remarkable figure. And he's written books such as Cocaine Politics, which tells us all about the drug running around the world that is conducted with the CIA's knowledge. And, you know, he's been a consultant on movies like the movie about the Dark Alliance, Gary Webb, who was the author of Dark Alliance. And I'm trying to think of the name of that movie, but it's one of those, you know, it's one of those movies that sticks with you because they come really close to some major truths there. And some of that other work around people like Barry Seal, who was one of those drug pilots who...
Was it Kill the Messenger? Or something
Kill the
like
Messenger,
that?
yeah, that's the name of the
Okay.
movie. Quite a good movie, actually. I think they did a nice job with it. And good memory, too. Everyone, you're watching The Dark Journalist Show. We're going to get deep now tonight in X Series 77, Deep State X-Operatives. And the other side of that is MKUltra Doomsday Network. The MKUltra part is particularly interesting considering the experiments that these people, you know, undertook to create the perfect assassins. And where they did it was very interesting. It's at a place called Fort Holabird, which is in Maryland and close to Baltimore. Now, it has a very interesting history, and it ties in with everything we're about to talk about. And if that wasn't enough, we're going to talk about how the Secret Service plays into this, and how the Secret Service plays into the continuity of government, and played into a number of these deep events, as Professor Scott has pointed out. One of the Secret Service agents who helped enlighten us around some of these subjects, and has a very important book that he put out called The Echo from Dealey Plaza, is actually the first Black Secret Service agent named Abraham Bolden. And, you know, Abraham goes all the way back to the Kennedy detail, and Kennedy, in fact, had plans to make him an ambassador to Africa and one of the African countries. And he had noticed a number of unusual things from his perch there in the Chicago office about an incident that was going on. So it was an early attempt. It was like a run-through for the assassination of President Kennedy. It took place on November 2nd, and there were a series of warnings involved. So Abraham Bolden, from raising this after the actual assassination took place in Dallas, he went to his superiors and said, there's something wrong with the word on this, because they're not telling you about this thing that took place on the 2nd, and I want to give you these details. And in fact, he did. Shortly after that, he was in fact set up for bribery and served some years in prison on a false charge. And even one of the key witnesses against him admitted that he had perjured himself on the stand. So it's a very unusual story, and it's all contained in that Echoes from Dealey Plaza book. One of the reasons that Abraham comes up tonight is that he recently started talking about someone who is very important to the conversation we're going to have, and that is Louis B. Sims, who we can start off by saying was a Secret Service officer and was a special agent in charge. But oddly enough, he has many more titles, as many of these figures do as we go into the continuity of government players. And that is Louis B. Sims, and this is actually a picture of him during the height of Watergate. And one of the things that was revealed recently was that although we are familiar with the idea that it's Alexander Butterfield who revealed the taping system that brought down the Nixon administration, it turns out no, it was Louis Sims who was the security coordinator for the White House at that point. And in fact, he was the one who turned the tapes over to the Congressional Committee. So right off the bat, history is getting spun on its head. And of course, Butterfield had a deep, deep relationship with the Nixon administration. No one's contesting that. However, this idea that he was the one who turned over the information about the taping system, it was Sims. Now we'll go even deeper and take a quick look at Louis B. Sims in history. There's a guy out there named Vince Palomara who is a very, very interesting writer, but his kind of incredible wealth of knowledge about the Secret Service has always been a great resource. And he showed up in something which was called the Banned documentary. Now it's The Men Who Killed Kennedy, The Guilty Men. And he was in that, and he actually was doing some remarkable information overviews about something that we now know of as the Secret Service stand down, where the Secret Service agents are getting on the back of the limousine before Kennedy pulls into Dealey Plaza, and the agent in charge waves them off and says, you know, get off there. You're not supposed to be on there. And they're like, what are you talking about? And they're really, you know.
It's standard operating procedure.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely. Well, you can see if you're planning an assassination like that, if those guys are on the back, it screws everything up, because then you can't get any of that trajectory going. So they came up with this whole thing about, you know, oh, well, he didn't want them on the back. It doesn't make any sense because they had always been back there. So it's always been very unusual. And, you know, what happens with the Secret Service is you have some good Secret Service agents who do their job and would risk their life for the president. And then you have other people. And it's a mixed bag, just like any chain of command and organization. So we're talking about the Secret Service. We're talking about the agents who, you know, exploited the position, and not the traditional kind of Secret Service agent who would protect the president ordinarily. What's amazing is, of course, as usual, it all comes back to Boston, because one of the major figures involved in this is fairly close by. Okay, a little bit of background on Sims. Louis B. Sims, 1950s, served 3 years. I mentioned it was Vincent Palomara who wrote the book. The book's called Survivor's Guilt: The Secret Service and the Failure to Protect President Kennedy. Louis B. Sims, 1950, served 3 years with U.S. Army intelligence at Fort Holabird. Remember Holabird now, because we're going to go deep. In Maryland, he entered the Secret Service in 461 and assigned to the Chicago office until 164. This is very interesting. This is where Bolden met him. And Abraham Bolden, just get a quick picture of Bolden here. Abraham Bolden, there he was, the first black Secret Service agent on the Kennedy detail. He was the one who reported the anomalies. One of the unusual things that he noted recently, and I'm going to read his statement that he made public, was that Sims, in fact, had a very unusual position when he was head of the Secret Service office out of Chicago. One of the things that he noted was that the other officers thought that he was either a CIA agent or an agent of a foreign power. And this is going to become very important as we look deeply into the subsequent career of Sims, and also his role in putting Bolden behind bars. Yes.
I think that's really interesting, because Secret Service agents have to be very observant of anything that looks a little suspicious, right? So they would be just the kind of people that would pick up on something not being quite right about Sims.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely.
Something just a little different, a little off.
Yes.
Right? They would be very intuitive people, you would say.
No question. Mm-hmm. They have to be incredible. They're trained observers to such a level that, you know, what they're getting with Sims is that he doesn't fit in there, and that he's spying, but who's he spying for? Now, he did, in fact, have a deep intelligence background, and we're going to get into that. Now, it does strike me that when we look at Sims, you know, we're getting kind of a certain idea about his background. We get something on the surface. Holabird is one, his military intelligence background. When he's a young man, and this is early 20s now, he has a chance meeting with Harry Truman, who is who's out of office, but he recommends, actually, I think you should join the Secret Service because you seem like you're well cut out for it, and recommends him. And right off the bat, with Sims, the Army had decided, we really want to take on you for our intelligence program. So we want you to go to Holabird. And he's there for 3 years. That's pretty dedicated because Holabird will be known as the Center for MKUltra and LSD testing. And so we're looking at a very, very deep facility as the years go. So if he's there for 3 years, man, he's learning a lot more than, say, an average Secret Service agent. He's on a totally different level. Now, this statement, which was placed on the public record by Abraham Bolden, I think you find very, very interesting. He talks about 2 agents, Louis B. Sims and then Richard A. Jordan. I'm just going to read from his post here. Quote, after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, Agent Sims was selected to serve as chief of the Interpol agency. This is another interesting aspect of his career, in my opinion, because Interpol, having that sweep of international police, basically, we find him popping up in Argentina, in the Middle East, and all over. This is another one of those characters who has that kind of world at his fingertips thing that we see so many of these deep state players have. This is an international police organization. Sims had previously been assigned as an agent in the Chicago office of the Secret Service. His assignment was a peculiar one in that Sims spent most of his time sitting in the office. He appeared to be working independently of the special agent in charge of the office. His lack of involvement in the day-to-day normal Secret Service routine activities led to an office rumor that Sims was actually a plant working for another government entity. Some office agents suspected that Sims was an agent of the CIA at the same time that he was assigned to the Secret Service. Agent Sims was transferred to Washington and was in charge of filing, safekeeping, and overseeing the secret recording tapes in the Oval Office during the administration of President Nixon. Although it was Alexander Butterfield that reportedly revealed the existence of the Nixon tapes before the Congressional Committee, it was known that Sims was the first to reveal the existence of the recordings during his testimony before the Congressional Committee on November 23rd, 1963. Or he says it was whispered. On November 23rd, 1963, that's the day after the Kennedy assassination, Agent Sims mysteriously vanished from the Chicago office. Mission accomplished. Several agents conjectured that Sims had been dispatched to Dallas, Texas, to assist in the investigation of Kennedy's murder. Agent Sims and Jordan were the 2 agents that were detailed by the then U.S. Attorney, Edward Hanrahan, to intimidate defense witnesses not to testify during my 2 trials. Richard Jordan, the other special agent in charge that he's referring to here, who worked with Sims, died of a gunshot wound to the head in Michigan. Which I also found interesting because if, in fact, they needed to keep Abraham silent about what he knew about this Chicago plot and the other things that the agents were suspicious of with Sims, that somehow the secret that Sims and his partner here, Jordan had, would lead to his elimination there in 1966. So the takeaway, something very unusual about Sims. First of all, he shows up after being at Fort Holabird for 3.5 years in the Secret Service. He's already met Truman, which is unusual. He's been in the Army. He's been in Army intelligence, psychological warfare. Then he goes into the Secret Service. Then he's in the Chicago office during the time when there's this early attempt on Kennedy, 20 days before the 22nd, November 2nd. There's a lot of very unusual things that happen around that. It's definitely a dry run for the actual assassination. But then we find Sims showing up at Watergate as the person handing over the taping system to the Congressional Committee that's investigating the Nixon administration. And the tapes, in fact, bring Nixon down. So now he's at the pinnacle, the center of two very important events that take presidents out. Then he's in Interpol, and then we're going to find him before the end of his career in a space agency. So we're going Mr. Deep State here with Louis B. Sims, and we have a kind of a front row seat with Abraham Bolden's, kind of firsthand testimony about how unusual Sims was. And what I found in looking further is that it was whispered that he was either associated possibly with Mossad or with a German Stasi intelligence unit. That people felt he was getting that kind of influence. So we're looking at a very unusual character. It could very well be that he's just working directly for a deep state entity and not a foreign power, but one deep, deep, deep inside the hollows, what Professor Scott would refer to as a deep state actor.
Did you find out anything about his background?
Louis.
Sims, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been saying it.
So, no, what I mean is
his early growing up, he's from
background. Does he happen to be German? Is he a Mason? Like what, I know these questions are going to come up.
It is very interesting. One of the key things I think about him comes up from a newsletter. It's hard to find information on Sims. This is what's fascinating.
Right, there's no Wikipedia, right?
No, but also you might find a lot of that information pretty jaded and dumbed down. As whenever I've gone to anything official about him, they miss all the key aspects of his life. They're like, oh, wasn't it great when he was there? What's weird is there's a newsletter, like his hometown newsletter that says, hey, Louis B. Sims still here. And, he actually died in 2013, but this is maybe from 2012. And they're like, he recently gave some kind of address to a school, and they went into this whole bio about him, which I think is quite interesting, and we're going to get into that as well. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep here on the Deep State and the X-Operatives involved in the Doomsday Network. The term Doomsday Network also comes out of this continuity of government, because continuity of government is where they originally had planned to survive a nuclear attack. If there was a decapitation strike on the head of the government at that point, this underground government, the overt and covert, the covert side would take over. And that's where we get the extensive spending on the underground bases. But that switch between those two has left a lot of sort of people out of the loop, because it's such a secretive network, and it's been exploited by these actors in the deep state. So this is what we're taking a look at tonight. And being it is episode 77, I guess that's good numerology, 77, 2020. We're looking good. I want everyone to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our free newsletter, because we've been seeing a lot of YouTube censorship.
More importantly,
Yes.
I have been notified that there was no YouTube notification about tonight's show. So the people who are here
came through the newsletter.
Yeah,
this is how it's working now. It's changed. It's literally changed dramatically, even over the past 6 months. So what you need to do is not rely on traditional YouTube notifications or social media in general. I mean, always follow the Facebook, facebook.com, Dark Journalist, twitter.com, @darkjournalist, and O-Wings Girl at Twitter, O-Wings Girl. That's always lots
Speaking
of
of wings, you're getting a lot of compliments on your hair tonight.
Well, I'll try not to let it go to my head. Here's an interesting thing. Now, first, make sure you signed up for the newsletter, number one. And what is amazing to me is that the amount of times I tell people to do this, and then I got you get these emails from time to time, and people say, well, I didn't get a notification, so I missed the program or whatever. And I say, do you have the newsletter? And they're like, oh, yeah, I meant to sign up for the newsletter. I'm going to do it now, So just go and do it. Take the 30 seconds to do it. It's very simple. And nothing big is going to happen, except that once a week, we're going to send you a notification for a show that's coming up. And the shows are on Fridays at 8 p.m., as you know, unless there's a holiday or some special event going on. That's when you can usually find us. The other thing, yes. What do you got?
Medley Childress says his hair does look great. It does. We'll
put in one of the keywords for this show is great hair. everyone. It's great to have you all out there. It's a huge crowd already tonight. And the second part of the program, we'll be taking your questions. And Miss Olivia will be sorting those out, as she usually does a fantastic job pulling in your ideas out of the ideas room, which is what we call chat, because we figured out a long time ago that chat just doesn't cut it as a name because there's too many intelligent ideas flowing around. So the ideas room, it is. Another thing I want to mention is when you ask the questions, ask them in caps because they're easier to catch that way.
Definitely.
Otherwise, they get lost in the wave of comments. Yes.
All right. So I'm going to throw you a question.
Yeah,
it's a little bit off topic, but Silver Fox wants to know, are the underground government the ones spraying the chemtrails?
Well, it's interesting because that program is secret, but it's out in the open. So it's one of those. It certainly... Their activities probably started this process, and now the government is in a position where they have to hide it, just like the deep state has committed something like an assassination or, the records around 9/11 or whatever it happens to be. When these things disappear, this is something where the deep state has acted on the public stage, but then the regular government is left to cover it up. So it's very interesting. It's kind of a combination of circumstances. One of the things I will say in relation to the deep state and how we need to think about it, there's been a lot of things around the alternative media talking about the cabal and the alliance and all that. That's all junk. That's all marketing junk. Continuity of government is a program that can be proven with documents. The links for the deep state, there's a whole wave of 5 decades of research from Professor Scott. We're able to tap into those incredibly nested details. So we don't need somebody's fantasy line about what might be happening, or, there's, a great strike by the cabal, but don't worry, because when they bomb Iran, like I was saying earlier, we've been hearing these narratives. Well, don't worry, that's actually Trump taking out the deep state in Iran. I've already said it doesn't work that way. The whole idea of the deep state is that it's here. And it's a system that operates in throughout the globe, but it is not, you can't locate the deep state in Iran saying they're taking out deep state targets in Iran. It's absurd. So when you hear that, when people do that kind of spin, just tell them, it's basically that I call them idiot clicks. It's clicks for idiots. Don't go for that. That is to get us into a whole different conversation. The fact is, we have a very, very great handle publicly on the continuity of government program, even though it's incredibly hidden. Just like the secret space program, there's enough documentation that we can utilize so that we don't need people's fantasies. When you hear these things about Fulford or, the other people, galactic ambassadors, or I'm reincarnated Edgar Casey, all that stuff, just throw that junk out. When I started dark journalism, I said it has to operate on 3 basic principles, very simple. And I'll go through them quickly for you here. The first principle is understanding that whenever there's a major event, there's 3 reactions. The first reaction is the official story, which is very often just to get the government off the hook, to save the institution, whatever it happens to be. And there's always lots of holes in that. And then the secondary story comes up. The secondary story is done, the counter story. It's done usually by professors, writers, analysts who see that the government is lying. So that's the second level. The media likes to call that one conspiracy theory. That's the way that works. Try to get rid of it because the media is largely in step with the official story. Then beneath that is junk conspiracy. That we're seeing an awful lot of junk conspiracy now. If somebody says, oh, they're bombing deep state targets in Iran, that's junk conspiracy. So just throw it out. What you want to do is go for that second level, the counter narrative, because remember, sometimes that third story is thrown in there to actually drive people back to the official story because it's too far out for a normal person to consume, or it's there to drive people into a blind alley. And we see that over and over again when it comes to these, trust this plan or that plan.
To not take any action on your own, right?
Yes.
You can be a digital warrior, but you don't actually have to do anything with your feet. You don't have to get up off your seat.
And you also don't have to violate your own principles because you're like, hey, I put this guy in office not to bomb other countries. And then they're like, well, don't worry, he's bombing the bad guys. And they're like, oh, okay, I don't have to protest, I guess. And this is the nature of the problem. But we see it over and over again. So I think it is worth noting here that the way that if we can kind of apply this filter, we'll have a much better experience, which is the official story, the secondary counter story, where there's a lot of good people unraveling the top story, and then junk conspiracy. And remembering that the majority of stuff that we just see out there to consume is junk conspiracy. And very often the junk conspiracy is driven by the people who are putting out the top. Okay, so is that pretty clear? I think it's pretty clear. It's an easy formula. The other thing I want to say about it is that whenever there's a major story, like this story about Suleiman, you always see those three active. We know the official story about it, and we know the secondary story. People have kind of pulled apart some of the actions of Mike Pompeo, for example, who I think should be fired or resign as Secretary of State immediately for trying to take the world over the brink into World War III scenario based on bad intel. Remember, he was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and all we have to do to think about the Central Intelligence Agency and bad intel is remember WMDs in Iraq have to get that Saddam out after putting him in there. So these are the types of things that we need to keep in mind, that when we're getting this intel, when they're flooding us with this reasons, that, there's an imminent attack and this general in Iran is responsible for it, we need to assassinate that general. We're not in a state of war with Iran, so assassinating one of their top leaders is an incredibly provocative act, which could take, years to kind of mitigate the damage from something like that. It's the largest foreign policy blunder of the Trump administration, who really hadn't made those kind of blunders previous to this. So it was very shocking. And their response afterwards, all the bizarre statements about bombing their historical, their sites and all this incredible things that they were saying. It was so bizarre. And then Pompeo was coming out and saying, actually, we've got more of their leaders targeted too. I mean, it's just off the chart. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And it was clear to me that Pompeo was the conduit for false intelligence, giving that to Trump. Trump was acting on it, thinking that Pompeo was plugged in. And so Trump made the biggest mistakes of his presidency, and Pompeo was going out there and, they were pressing him. They were like, well, can you bring this imminent, do you still stand by the fact that there was an imminent threat? And he's like, there's always an imminent threat when dealing with Iran. Well, the problem is that doesn't rise to the level that's required for taking out one of their leading people. They say it was the number 2 man in the country. So if you don't have a real threat, then you just violated international law, and you should fire yourself by resigning, or President Trump should immediately fire Pompeo. So that's very clear. And it actually ties into all this because Iran comes up quite a bit. So, but as we play into this story, I think, is very important about Iran. And we have to remember that we're looking at a lot of pressures to get into a war over there when there's no reason to do that. We can definitely negotiate. So there's this whole rush to war is actually quite bizarre, and it's something we need to keep our eye on for 2020. Yes, Miss Olivia.
David Tormina wanted me to ask you, DJ, do you suspect that the strike on Soleimani is somehow related to the archaeology war? Trump did mention bombing cultural sites, oddly enough.
It's true. Well, it's interesting because Catherine Austin Fitts has noticed a program going on to eliminate classic sites. We saw this with all the fires of the grand cathedrals in France. And these are part of the cultural wars. The archaeology wars are always very interesting because they relate to very important artifacts and things that may be hidden that we're not aware of. There's no question that in archaeology wars that we've seen it all the way from the hot zone there in the Bahamas to Egypt to Samaria, Iran. There is a great legacy of this kind of thing. And you always have to keep an eye on it when we're going to war with them. Just like, it always comes up that Nostradamus had said something about, it was a Persian in a blue turban who gets us into World War III, essentially. I think these things are important to keep in mind as they're kind of hints from the past, and they kind of give us a framework to look at these things in. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're in X77. Now we're going to go back. We took a look at Lewis B. Sims, and I think that Sims is going to become more and more important now that we're bringing him forward. And the blackout on Sims information, it's going to be totally different. And a lot of that, like I said, is thanks to the work of Abraham Bolden. Now, Bolden, I want to mention something else, which is he currently has petitioned the Trump administration, as he did the Obama administration, for a pardon, since the main sources against him admitted that they perjured their testimony, and he had to spend a number of years in jail. Interestingly enough, one of the people he was across from the cell when he was arrested, when he was being held, was a person named Richard Case Nagell. Now, this is very interesting because I did a show with a writer named Dick Russell, and he had written a fantastic tome on the life of this unusual spy who was deeply involved in tracking the Kennedy assassination. And it's a very interesting interview, and I will link it in the description when we're done here. One of the things I want to point out is that the whole hubbub and the reason that they kind of got into the situation, I believe, where they had to put Bolden in jail, was because of this warning that came up. And because this relates to Sim, I'm going to go into this a little bit, although we're going to have to move because as we track the deep state, we're going all the way here from the late 50s now right up to the present. So that's the way this is going to move. Okay, let's take a look at this figure, which was really the cause of the whole thing. This was someone named Thomas Vallee. Vallee had an unusual background that was so similar to Oswald's that it was considered that he basically was the first version of Oswald, and that the assassination, the dry run for it, was in Chicago and was going to take place there. Vallee had been in the military. He actually had been in Japan working at a secret U-2 base, as Oswald had been at Tsugi. And it's very interesting to note that there's a number of things that really a number of us in the research community have noted. This one is from a site called 22november1963.org.uk, and I think they did a nice job of making these bullet points, so they make it easy for me here. Here we go. Lee Harvey Oswald and Thomas Arthur Vallee, both were former Marines. Both had served at Marine bases in Japan that hosted the U-2 spy plan. This is very important because the U-2 was kind of like the hidden tech now. It was something that they definitely wanted to keep off the radar. So the people that they had working with it were there for a reason. So not your low-level average worker. I mean, no one in the military is really low-level, but just in terms of rank and in terms of specialities. So now both had been involved with anti-Castro Cubans, Oswald in New Orleans, Vallee at a training camp at Levittown on Long Island in New York. Both had recently started working at premises that overlooked the routes of presidential parades. Now, this is very interesting. We have to always imagine, in the case of the JFK assassination, that the assassin, the alleged assassin, Oswald, he gets a job at the Texas School Book Depository without knowing the president is coming by there. He gets the job 6 weeks before the assassination, and it just so happens then they announce President Kennedy is going to be going by there, and all of his assassin fantasies have come true. Well, it's the same thing with Vallee. He gets the job a month before at this printing place, and it overlooks this unusual turn going onto an expressway there in Chicago. And you know what's weird is I found out that eventually, not at the time, but eventually they would call that Kennedy Expressway.
Wow.
Even though he never made that trip. Isn't that weird? It's very strange. Mm-hmm. So let's go a little bit further with the combinations. So Oswald was at the Texas School Book Depository overlooking the parade route. Vallee at IPP Lithoplate, 625 West Jackson Boulevard in Chicago. And if you're from Chicago, you probably know where that is. Two other curious coincidences. The tip-off to the FBI about the assassination plot in Chicago came from an informant identified as Lee. Now, this is very interesting. A lot of people, because it's been brought up that Oswald was penetrating assassination rings and feeding the information back to the CIA or the FBI. He actually had been known as an FBI and CIA informant. So they instantly scrubbed the record on this. However, Abraham Bolden noted that when they were getting this information about the Chicago plot, it was coming from their informant. The informant's name was Lee. He didn't know the rest of the name of the informant. But the one who was working with these agencies, they said, this is Lee that's giving us this information. That's very interesting considering the level that Oswald was involved. It makes a good case that he is the Lee that's giving them the information here. Okay. Thomas Valley was arrested at 9:10 a.m. Chicago time, having been under constant surveillance since the previous day. 5 minutes later, at 10:15 Washington time, President Kennedy's press spokesman, Pierre Salinger, announced the visit to Chicago had been canceled. So they canceled the trip in this case. They didn't cancel Dallas. The decision to cancel the trip had presumably been made several minutes earlier, and the timing had led some commentators to figure it out. Oh, this is related to something very odd. Now, there's something, a very strange twist here in relation to Valley. And Valley's background gives him that, you know, the CIA worked with him. He worked at these training camps, these anti-Castro training camps. So we get the impression that he was a really good kind of Manchurian candidate for this. A couple of other quick things about Valley. On Thursday, October 31st, Halloween there, before the November 2nd trip, 1963, a landlady telephoned the Chicago police telling them that she had discovered 4 rifles in one of her rooms, which was rented to a group of 4 men. The police informed the Secret Service, who took 2 of the 4 men into custody the next day. There are no records of any weapons having been discovered. The 2 men were interrogated, but refused to admit being part of a conspiracy to murder the president. In fact, they were let go. An unknown source accused a man named Thomas Arthur Valley, the unknown source is this Lee, of threatening to assassinate JFK. Although Valley was not associated with the 2 men in custody, he appeared to be a right-wing extremist, and he certainly owned several guns and a large quantity of ammunition. 9 o'clock on Saturday morning, 2 hours before Kennedy was due to land at O'Hare, Valley was stopped by police on the pretext of having committed a minor driving offense and was arrested. Kennedy's trip was called off at the last moment. So Valley, really, he's like an early Oswald. And if we go deeper into his story, we find out that he had a metal plate in his head from the Korean War. So this is somebody that they really had a lot time to work on and really develop him into the kind of perfect candidate for this. One last comment from Bolden, which is also public, and this is what he had to say. After President Kennedy was assassinated, the Secret Service chief said that I was a liar, framed me, put me in prison, and tried to declare me insane. But I had a strong wife and the infinite creator cosmic consciousness protecting me and my family. Read The Echo from Daily Plaza and witness the omnipotent God in action, and let there be peace. This is a very interesting, I think it gives us some idea of where Bolden was coming from. And when you read that book, there's some unusual things that he says there that let you know that something almost spiritual was happening to him during this process. And it's also very interesting how the Kennedys wanted to adopt him to be an ambassador. Another quick look at Valley here. So we lock him in. Here was the early make. Here was the first version, the kind of version 1 of Oswald.
He's really creepy looking guy. All right, let's just finish.
I would tend to agree with you there. I don't think that's any exaggeration. Now
He'd be a great character actor, right? For James Cagney movie.
Well, I mean, it's a little later on that. He's in the 60s.
Yeah, but
there,
he
so
looks the type, right?
maybe kind of like a Bond villain. It's terrifying. Now, when we go a little bit deeper into this, of course, the person who ended up playing this role and getting the shaft was Oswald, and that's Oswald there when he's being booked. And we all remember that Oswald wasn't given any legal counsel. He was interrogated, but no recordings were made, and there was no stenographer present for any of his questioning the whole time he was in custody, which is pretty absurd. When we look at Oswald, we know so much about his background working with Bannister, and who was a right-wing person. So this whole idea of him being a communist is really, he was an undercover agent. And I did a whole documentary on this called Agent Oswald, the CIA Patsy, that wraps in all that. But let's look at someone in this same milieu. Again, trained through Army intelligence, again, in Atsugi, around this strange secret project called the U-2. He's at Atsugi in Japan and would later say that he had a meaningful relationship with Oswald, that they had worked. He was suggesting they had worked on an intelligence project together, but he never let that detail out, unfortunately. Let's look at this headline: Bank robber, Manchurian candidate linked to JFK assassination probe. This is later when they were probing the assassination in the 70s, and they were starting to realize the stories of the people involved. And this is when the CIA was getting really thrown out. A lot of their stories, a lot of their assassination plots were falling apart. And in fact, they would reach such a low level that, in fact, this form of the CIA would actually go offshore and come back. We're going to talk about that. That is the Safari Club, which Peter Dale Scott has done such great work on. So what we have here is someone named Nagell who has some similarities to Oswald in the sense that he was put in an orphanage when he was younger. And when he came out, it seemed like they were priming him for intelligence work from a very early age. But Nagell has some very interesting stories that he was put by the CIA as a double agent, pretending to give information to the Russian intelligence, KGB. Now, somewhere along the line, they gave him the mission. They said they're going to try and have this guy as one of their own operatives set up for the assassination of the president. And they put him on the trail to track Oswald. And this is what Nagell did. And in his, the many interviews that he had with Dick Russell, he unveiled the story, although he's always kept certain things back. Now, one of the things I want to say about Richard Case Nagell is that he was really somebody that I think when we look at him, we have to see him as almost a triple agent, because at a certain point, when he's going and checking back with his authorities, he doesn't know who he's working for anymore. It's a very unusual situation. So he learns that there's a second person who's using the name Leon Oswald, who's doing all these things and penetrating all these groups. And so there's the whole second Oswald thing comes into the story. So I highly recommend looking into his story through Dick Russell, the man who knew too much. However, for our purposes, here we have another operative in the deep state being manipulated. So let's take a look at how he handled it. As it turned out, he realized now, a month before the assassination took place, that there was a possibility that he was going to get blamed because they might be putting him on this trail of Oswald to just show up as the patsy himself. So what he does is he walks into an El Paso bank and he fires a round into the ceiling, and then he waits on the corner to get picked up by the cops. And when they grab him, he said, I'm glad you're here, because I don't want to be in public when the assassination takes place. When I want to make sure that I'm in prison so nobody can blame it on me. And they're like, what is this guy talking about? You're going to jail. But it's a very unusual way to get yourself placed into custody. One of the things that they found when they picked him up, they found a number of unusual things, including notebooks. But one of the notebooks they kept off the record, and one of them they showed, but this very unusual ID was in there. And well, it might be kind of hard to see there, but I'm going to tell you what it is. In fact, it is the ID of Lee Harvey Oswald. And it has a slightly different information, but it's his picture and it's his name. And Nagell had it in his possession. In fact, we're getting the impression there that he's passing himself off as Oswald, very unusually. They arrest Nagell and put him in jail for 4 years for bank robbery. Of course, he never attempted to rob the bank. He just wanted to make sure he wasn't blamed for the assassination of the century. Now, it's very interesting because...
Can you follow up on what happened to him?
Yes. Well, what do you...
I don't know. I want to know.
Oh, yes.
What happened? I mean, did he serve his full sentence? Was he released? Then what?
No. It gets very interesting.
It gets weirder?
Yeah. We're going to go deeper on it. You can't just leave Nagell there. I know. He has a very, very unusual background. But again, we're seeing him like Valley, and we're seeing him in a way like Sims, because Sims comes out of Fort Holabird, and he's taught all these military intelligence techniques. And Oswald is, brought up. I mean, he has a family, but he serves all his time in an orphanage, and he has an unusual track record. Then he joins the Civil Air Patrol, so he's easy to program in this sense. And then we have another Fort Holabird connection coming up too in relation to Howard Hunt. So Fort Holabird in relation to Sims and his 3.5 years there, and in relation to the military intelligence training of Nagell and also our friend Thomas Valley. Now, what's interesting when we look at these cases is we start to wonder, what are they doing with these operatives? And so I started to look into Fort Holabird deeply, and one of the most interesting things I found out about it, which is quite remarkable, is that, in fact, it burned down under suspicious circumstances, which was probably the only thing that they could do at that point. So while I switch over to that, Miss Olivia, what do you got out there?
Let me see if I have a good question for you. Oh, Grandma Tippy Toes wanted to know, do you think that Oswald was on the X-Protect side?
Well, it's interesting because Oswald, wherever you look deeply into Oswald's history, he is listed around NASA. He's listed, there's all kinds of UFO connections, including the fact that Guy Bannister was running him, and Guy Bannister is the original X-Files FBI guys tracking UFO reports. So that's where we got the whole notion of X in relation to the UFO file, because he created those. And then Bannister shows up in New Orleans, and he's putting Oswald out there, giving out flyers saying, hey, I'm a communist and all that. But Oswald is working with him on all this right-wing stuff. So it's part of his intelligence training. I think it's interesting to think of Oswald in that way, because one of the things that came out through something called the Torbett document was all these revelations around the Defense Industrial Security Command, and that was run by Werner von Braun, and they tested advanced technology, and they listed, along with Bannister, they listed Oswald as one of the employees for DISC. So yes, he definitely was involved in the programs. It seems to me that he's such a double and triple agent that I don't really think we know where his loyalties were in relation to that. So I don't know. I think he was used inside of this X technology program, but I don't know what side he came out on. He was so young. That was another thing we have to remember about this guy. I mean, when all this took place, he's a 24-year-old guy. He'd already been to Russia. He already had one child and another one. Two. We had one child and one on the way, and then he also. So yeah, he had 2 children, and he had a wife here, a Russian wife here, and he was staying at Walter Dornberger's protege's place there. And Walter Dornberger is that paperclip Nazi they bring over here and create the X program with. So all the X planes are all Dornbergers. So it all is very unusual. So in a way, that question is, he sits in the middle of all that. And this is the dynamic thing about Oswald, is if you really look at him portrayed in the media, as he's this disgruntled guy who wants a chance to be famous, and so he decides to get a job stacking books for $1 an hour, and he just gets lucky enough to shoot President Kennedy. That's their version. Seems absurd, because when you look at all the connections that he has, including George de Mohrenschildt, who's a millionaire oil geologist, it just doesn't add up. And it goes beyond absurd. It's just kind of like such a byline now that I think that the Oswald story is like the punchline. It's like the Epstein didn't kill himself of its day. Yes, what do you got?
Well, you interviewed Judith Berry Baker a few years ago.
Oh, yeah.
So what do you think of her and her story?
Judy Baker is interesting. I think all we have to do really in terms of taking her story at face value is just observe the fact that she's another one who said that he was associated with the CIA. And it seems to me over and over again, there's a number of people who suggest that, including his wife, Marina. So, I think when you look at it, the idea of his connections, I did a whole documentary on his connections to the CIA because he had so many. So she added to that, and she's in the documentary. I think she gives very good testimony there. There are other people who don't, who feel that her story goes further and that, they may have had a relationship, but he didn't share all these things with her. So we don't know. I mean, there's no proof, but we know that she knew who he was. She knew him and she was there at Riley Coffee Company. What else you got there?
Oh God! Well, there's a lot of Trump talk. Do we want to go back there?
No, we'll save Trump for the question and answer section. But it is good, and I know it is pretty major. There is a kind of a crossroads that Trump is at in relation to this. And remember that Trump relates to all the X technology because of his uncle John Trump, who came right out of MIT, which is about 10 minutes from here, and remember that all those records are in the actual box X at MIT. So, the X steganography is pretty thick. Yes.
I just wanted to make a little comment. Unfortunately, there's a little bit of going back and forth in the ideas room about Q and Q's legitimacy. And
yes.
People are very passionate one way or the other. Just say this is, nobody's gonna change anybody's mind in the ideas room, so it's kind of wasted energy. So
proselytizing for Q isn't going to do it.
and arguing the opposite viewpoint isn't going to do anything.
No,
either,
I think it's pretty simple, which is we're in an age of transparency, and so anonymous posting on message boards, especially like a 4chan, 8chan, and there's another one now, 8kun, I think it is. All that stuff. Anyone who's an expert on that computer stuff will tell you that. Basically, it could be anybody's game now. So it's so open for manipulation.
Totally.
What it is, whatever one thinks of how it started out, what it is now is simply a computer simulation. And it is literally a dynamiting operation. So it's very clear. And, it didn't say anything about this Iranian attack that came up. And it's had a number of failed predictions. I just think it's time to part company with that kind of information. I don't buy into things that are anonymous in that sense because, WikiLeaks would have a whistleblower come forward and then they would say, okay, the whistleblower is anonymous, but we are standing here with the information and their information over and over again proved to be correct. These other things are like games, and we know that originally there were internet games out there before this stuff, and I think that somebody got the idea to kind of roll the conspiracy alternative people off a cliff with a game, and we can see it kind of has gone pretty far. But no, I don't have any, I don't have any quarrel with the people who follow that material, but I don't follow it. It has no relevance to the show. And the work that I do here with Dark Journalists, that's a fact. You can take that to the bank. And watch out for how that stuff's manipulated too. Yes.
Yeah, okay, so David Termina's question. So was the Safari Club coordinating above the CIA in the JFK assassination?
Well, it's very interesting because the Safari Club is born in the late 70s. So we have to keep that in mind because they didn't really need the Safari Club at the time. During the Kennedy administration, the CIA was all over the world, and they weren't defanged yet as they would be partially defanged during the 70s, mostly because of the inquiries into their activities in the assassination business. So the Safari Club in earnest gets its kickstart in the 70s during the end of the Ford administration.
Are they the same people or largely?
Yes, actually, that's a great point because Richard Helms, who is a major figure in the JFK assassination and would be like a lieutenant to Dulles, he handpicked by Dulles as a successor. He would be the CIA director from 66 to 73, but then Nixon would throw him out, knowing that he was trying to manipulate him. And there's a great deal of back and forth about that, about Nixon sending people over there and saying, like, if you go after me on Watergate, it's going to come back to the JFK assassination and the stuff that you guys did. And that, Helms, who's like a cool cucumber usually, jumped up on his desk, red-faced, and was like, we had nothing to do with that, So this is the nature of the thing. Nixon knew, and they knew Nixon, and it was like this incredible thing. So what he does is he fires him as CIA director in 73, in early 73, because Watergate's breaking, and he's like, this guy's not going to be on my side anyway. What I'll do is I'll make him ambassador to Iran. And when he does that, Helms takes the position of building up this kind of Middle East network, and it becomes part of an arms network. And we're going to get into the Safari aspect. But it becomes a group of arms dealers and drug dealers and intelligence heads from all these different nations, like France and African countries. And what primarily they've been stopped by Congress after Watergate and all these things. And the CIA have been kind of relieved of their duties of doing covert action in places like Angola. And there's something called the Clark Amendment, where they really can't do these types of activities. So they go offshore and they develop this group of ex-CIA people. Of course, you're never an ex-CIA agent. That's the way it works, unless they really throw you out. But if you're just fired, or if you have embarrassed the agency, you still remain there. That's why we got so much information from Doug Caddy on E. Howard Hunt. Yes.
Just a quick question. Who are these people? What are they made of?
Well, the CIA is very interesting. I think that we have to remember the roots of the Central Intelligence Agency, which is, it comes out of, the way we have it now, it comes out of something called OPC. Originally, Truman didn't even want to create the CIA because he said, I don't believe in an American Gestapo. Well, he should have stuck to his guns because that's what we got. But what they had was this agency that was going to coordinate intelligence. That's what Truman was thinking of. But in the middle of all that were these operators, and they were called the OPC, and they would go over there and fix elections, and they would, run trains off rails and do all kinds of covert activities. And so Truman became very nervous about them. He went to the CIA and he said, you have to get them under control or get rid of them, do something. And this Office of Policy Coordination was run by a guy named Frank Wiseman, and it was all to buffer against the communist influence and this kind of thing. But they were doing so many off-the-hook things that Truman was feeling this was going to have a lot of blowback, which it did. But what happened was the head of the CIA at that time was Allen Dulles, and he saw an opportunity because, remember, the CIA was started primarily by Wall Street lawyers, at which Dulles was one. He's a Sullivan and Cromwell lawyer, and his brother was, Secretary of State, but he was a lawyer. So it had that interest. Will be part of the business interests. When we feed this intelligence to the president, it'll have a skew towards business interests. That's where we got the original problem with the CIA. And I'll tell you, we still have the exact same problem that they had, and they never got the agency under control, except for this brief period in the 70s that we're talking about. But the Safari Club came along, took it offshore, and waited till the Reagan administration, and boom, they put William Casey, who's the ultimate deep state actor, in charge of the CIA. And that's where you got all the Contra wars and the crack epidemic and all these things. So this is the kind of the history of it. The problem is the deep state activity is so throughout that the only way we can get a handle on it is by going in character by character, which is kind of the deconstruction that we're doing tonight. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist program. We are deep, deep into it now, into X Series 77. And we're looking here at X-Operatives, MKUltra, Doomsday Network. This is it. this Doomsday Network is very real and very powerful and very active. And they exist using these emergency powers, such as some of the emergency powers that the Trump administration claimed in relation to this incident. So we have to take a deep look at who is around these and how in history the COG, continuity of government players, have played out and given us this. How are you doing out there?
Doing great.
Fantastic.
I almost want to skip the whole show and cut to the chase, but I'll save this question.
Oh, no, go ahead. What do you got?
Lawrence of Aragon wants to know, how do we get rid of the CIA is the real question. I 100% agree.
Well, this was President Kennedy said, he gave something to the Joint Chiefs, and it said, I want you to take over all responsibility for foreign covert activities. That would have been the end of the CIA that we know now. They would have been defanged from all these activities. So it was never got implemented because he wasn't around long enough to make it happen. But that's what he sent over. It had basically said they're not in charge anymore of this activity. See, the other thing that happened was that Harry Truman, who had set up the CIA and made the Frankenstein, he wrote this op-ed for the Washington Post, and it said, mend it or end it, basically. And if you can't put it back to its original mandate, then get rid of it. It was very simple. And he was the one who had created it through the National Security Act in 1947. So it's a big problem. I pointed out in relation to things that come up in our world, like TTSA and stuff, when these groups come in and they're talking about UFOs, and they're like, we're going to have special information for you and look at our new TV program. And then you go look at the board and it's all CIA players, including, 3 decades experience at a high level. You're in trouble, and you instantly have to reject that. Unfortunately, we have people in the UFO field around the UFO file who I guess are just looking for some recognition, and they're willing to go along with stuff like that. But you can't. And especially when a lot of them made careers saying, hey, you can't go along with the CIA because they block all this stuff. So you can't very lightly turn around and start palling around with them. It doesn't make any sense. So we have to be very, I think, clear on those things when it comes to the Central Intelligence Agencies. Really, really big problem in so many different aspects. And when we see it come up around independent media, forget it. It has to be booted out completely, because we still have the ability to do that, unlike the mainstream media, who are on their hands and knees begging them for intel and stories. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting how some people are like, well, we hate them over here, but they're great over here. And
yeah, how do you reason that out? It is interesting,
myself.
Isn't it? It's like you spend all this time saying, oh, well, the CIA blocked us, and they hide records and they hid this UFO stuff. And then there's this company comes out and says, we have $50 million and a bunch of CIA officers on the board. And the same people want to work with them? That doesn't make any sense. So obviously, we have that issue. And what's interesting about this is it's kind of bizarre, too, because these people are openly Central Intelligence Agency figures. It's not like it's a hidden thing and we're guessing it. They list it as part of their, they have, for example, in the To the Stars Academy, they have over 100 years of experience of CIA. And what we know predominantly about the CIA is, they lie to the public. Think of WMD and think of a number of different things. A clandestine spy operation department has its place, but the protocols have all been stripped away, and they've run away with their power. So therefore, any opportunity that we have not to deal with them. And, it has to be kind of a central tenet that when you're working with the CIA, they're working in their own interest, and they're working, it's a major piece of how the deep state operates is through this clandestine, unchecked power. And that's exactly what we need to get rid of by bringing transparency to those things. That would be my way of thinking about it. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
I'm glad you think so. Everyone, it's great to have you here. It's a huge crowd tonight. It's fantastic.
And I got to tell you, the Ideas Room is full of, there's a lot of different conversations going on. It's
well, that's
craziness.
Great. Yeah. While I have your attention, make sure to sign up for the Dark Journalist newsletter. That keeps us in touch, and that will let you know about all the exciting events that we have coming up for you in 2020 and the amazing guests that will be part of our shows that are coming, and you're going to want to be a subscriber as well. So now is the time to do it, and make sure that you get behind the work that we're doing here and support the program. Trust me, it's going to pay off for you, because we've made it incredibly affordable. And when you think about the things that we have coming up, you're going to want to be there first.
Yeah, we have a special treat coming up.
Yes, something very, very important. But let's go back now into our Deep State operatives, the X-Operatives. Now we've seen, and we will follow up on Nagell, I promise. So we've seen Nagell. We have seen Thomas Valley. Of course, we saw Oswald, and we saw Louis B. Sims. These are some of the X-Operatives. Now let's take a look at how this interfaces with the continuity of government players and bring it all back to the Secret Service again, which we're going to do over and over again in this program. The Secret Service are going to come up. Take a look at this picture. Olivia, do you recognize anyone in that picture?
Well, you showed this to me earlier, and I obviously recognized Nixon.
Okay.
And then in the middle, it's help. Donald Rumsfeld.
Yes.
Looking quite young.
And who's shaking hands with Nixon?
I can't remember.
It's Dick Cheney.
Oh,
It's okay. Look,
okay.
Cheney and Rumsfeld. That was fun to keep you in suspense.
Okay.
Cheney and Rumsfeld's. This is to show just how far back they go. And it was, in fact, Rumsfeld who was in with the government and was already doing these programs overseas as part of the Nixon administration. They were setting up the equivalent of, what would be NGOs now, but they were aid foundations in places like Indonesia and stuff. And this is how they were getting intelligence back. But Rumsfeld and Cheney developed this relationship here. And that picture is from 1972. So when we go back and we look at just how far back these individuals go, Rumsfeld will become the youngest defense secretary in 1976 under Ford, in 75. And well, he's chief of staff, and then he becomes defense secretary. And his liaison to CIA, the leader, will be George H.W. Bush. Now, Bush, Cheney, and Rumsfeld will all come back with a vengeance when Bush becomes VP under Reagan, and then becomes president, and then his son becomes president. And this is where the continuity of government players just go off the scale. Now, interestingly enough, it's in this pocket of time here where the CIA is starting to lose power that the Safari Club gets dreamed up. I'm going to read some very interesting quotes from Professor Scott about the Safari Club. But let's look at these continuity of government players. Let's think of a list now of continuity of government players involved in deep events. Now, Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney will form a major wing of the continuity of government planning for the 1980s. Previously, this had been called the Doomsday Project, or the Doomsday Planning, and they literally referred to it as a Doomsday Network. And ostensibly, it was set up because in the 50s, they were worried about this nuclear wars, and they said, we need a secondary government underground, as I started off with. So they came up with this idea, we're going to build these massive underground bases and that can withstand a nuclear attack. And if anything, if there is an exchange, we'll still have another government operating under these mountains and all the rest. And this is where so much of the infrastructure came from that built up the Cold War. But now all those underground bases are still there, remember? So, and that construction has continued. And so this idea of an underground government is very real. This isn't a science fiction concept. So let's talk a little bit about how this came to be. So they had emergency funding for it because it was nuclear related. Therefore, it was the highest possible secrecy. That's another thing. They could get around Congress. They didn't have to say exactly what they were doing or where it was, whatever it happened to be. Only a few people in the National Security Council would be in the loop. So as it developed, it got further and further out of hand. And then by the time you throw the Kennedy administration out by eliminating President Kennedy, the covert government that's been in development there, and which Eisenhower warns about in his speech, they move in, basically. They're moving in to take over the thing. They have wars to run. They want to take over things in relation to the UFO file. They have a space program to make into a black space program that is completely off the books. And they'll develop the secret space program while NASA, while it goes to the moon, yes, but then it slowly dies a death for 50 years until we start hearing about it again now with things like the Space Force. So it's quite interesting when you think of it and the power that this secondary group, this secondary government has. And so let's track it back to continuity of government. Now, in the 1980s, the people who were selected to kind of expand this continuity of government planning are, two of the main ones are Rumsfeld and Cheney. Interestingly enough, at that point, Cheney is just a congressman. He's not even in government as an official. And Rumsfeld's not in government at all. He is the CEO of a pharmaceutical company that's developing.
Ooh, my ears pricked up. A pharmaceutical company?
What are they developing? But aspartame.
Ugh.
Yeah. So, he has a totally different kind of trajectory going on there. Quite interesting with his connections, however. So the idea of bringing those two in to do this kind of end of the world planning is odd. And then the person that they head up the operation is Ollie North. So the boss of the entire thing is VP George Bush. So we have Bush working again with his old friends Rumsfeld and Cheney from the Ford administration. This thing has gone on for a while. It goes back even further than that, as I'm going to show here shortly, which is that Prescott Bush, who is George H.W. Bush's dad, is the man who sponsors Nixon in the early days. And he has his deep connections. But one of the unusual things that came up in his career when he was a senator, early on now, he, before all this kicks in, he heads up a bank that is called the Union Bank that's doing business with the Nazis in 1942. We've been at war with them for a while. And so Roosevelt moves to shut down the bank and says it's trading with the enemy and all the rest. But as it turns out, even though he headed up the operation of the bank, Bush does not serve any time for it. Everybody gets a whack on the wrist. And they said that the reason was, or one of the reasons, I talked to this with Jim Mars about this, actually. And he said the reason was because Bush was the head of the USO.
Right, he created it for that express purpose.
Yeah, so the idea would be
it's whitewashing.
I do feel that maybe this is interesting because then they would have really lost, saying that this guy is a Nazi spy and he developed the USO. It would have been too demoralizing at that point. So they let it go. As they had let go kind of a fascist plot to overthrow FDR in 1936. So we have a very interesting set of circumstances there around George H.W. Bush's father, Prescott Bush, who will become the senator from Connecticut. But he sponsors Nixon, and Nixon develops a tight relationship with a lot of those paperclip forces that are coming over. So his business interests are all tied up with this. So it's quite interesting when we look at Nixon, because Nixon's a very interesting and mixed case. Because he was easy to manipulate as well. But cashing in on some favors, Prescott Bush has Nixon appoint George Bush, who can't seem to get into Congress no matter what he does. And he loses his run for Senate in the 60s because he's so lackluster. But he makes him ambassador to China, ambassador to the UN. He gives him all these official positions so that finally he becomes the CIA director in 1976. He'd had a deep history with the CIA before that. And many people would point out that George H.W. Bush, his oil company was named Zapata Oil. And Zapata was the code name for this Bay of Pigs takeover of Cuba operation. So that's all the way back in 1961. So he's already deep with the CIA. So by the time he is the head of the CIA in 76, it's old, school. Those connections are already go back 2 decades. It's interesting, though, to think about how he leaves, because when Carter first gets in, he keeps him on. And then as the story goes, Carter says, give me all the information on the UFO file. And Bush says, well, that's on a need-to-know basis. Don't worry, like, we'll tell you when you need to know. And then Carter fires him. So it's kind of a good move there. But we can see that Bush just hung around, and then he actually ran for president in 1980. And that brings us to the Reagan assassination, which I want to cover here in terms of the next Manchurian candidate assassin we're going to look at, and that is John Hinckley Jr. How are we doing out there, Miss Olivia?
It's cuckoo tonight.
It is. I know, they're listening with rapt attention.
No, they are not. It's the opposite. Okay, David Termina wanted to know, DJ, was Nixon double-crossed by Bush, Rumsfeld, and Cheney?
Oh, boy. Well, we know that Bush, for sure, was one of the people who turned on him. And at that point, Nixon had got him appointed to be the head of the RNC. So, you know, Bush turning on him was a pretty severe blow to him at the end. But Nixon was headed out the door strictly because of the fact that he was acting at that point as his own president. He thought after opening up China and stuff, he was unstoppable. And then they were like, well, we want to do the general agreement on tariffs and trade for South America, and Nixon didn't agree with the idea. They would push that through in the 90s and have all those incredible, you know, people thrown off their farms, and really the horrible things that happened with NAFTA and GATT and all the jobs that were lost and everything else. So Nixon was smart about it. He didn't want to do it, but the Trilateral Commission, which was set up really by the Rockefellers to kind of be its own version of the Council on Foreign Relations, they were very powerful. And so the candidate that they handpicked was Carter, interestingly enough. So that's a deep piece of the story. But yeah, it's a good question. Okay, so we're going microcosm, macrocosm. Let's look at macrocosm, continuity of governments. We have some idea what that is. Yes, what do you got?
Well, since you're going to talk COG.
Yes.
Jim Roy wanted to know, isn't the 9/11 Patriot Act just the implementation of COG as a coup apparatus now used against Trump?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
As a matter of fact, Professor Scott makes the point that we're still under the 9/11 emergency powers, and that's how we got continuity of government enacted. And in fact, they did enact the rules of continuity of government during 9/11 when Cheney disappeared into a mountain for 3 months with a huge staff and came out, you know, with all this stuff like the Patriot Act and all that. That's all continuity of government activity, as was the use of the secret telecommunications network and everything else that took place. So continuity of government has been utilized, and we are under emergency constitution suspending rules. Now, this is the interesting thing, that one of the things that Professor Scott points out is we need to get the continuity of government 9/11 emergency lifted. But every year when they renew the NDAA, they include, every president since has signed off on that. W. Bush, Obama, and President Trump signs off on it every year. And it's to his own disillusion, by the way, because getting him to do that and getting him to brag about how we're spending more money, you know, he's like, we just spent $2 trillion on the military, and he signed off on the largest NDAA bill. I'm sorry, but, you know, we're not at war. And so, you know, the idea that we're going to use that kind of money on the military is absurd. We should be cutting that probably in half, dramatically, in any rate. But it's all, you know, that's the money that we see on the surface. That's not to mention the black budget money. So we can only imagine the kind of money that's disappearing there in that system. So we're in a really big boondoggle phase with that. And the problem is neither party has the guts to stand up to it. So you don't hear people saying, hey, stop all the defense spending. Even liberal Democrats are like, well, you know, bring on the NDAA money. So before, you would always have this back and forth about it. These guys want to spend a lot on the military and defense, and these other guys are against it because they think the money can be spent elsewhere, like building good schools, for example. Have you seen the schools lately? They're not looking so hot. So, you know, this goes round and round, though. So we've invested so much in our control of things through the military that, you know, it's like you can't get out without the entire country having this conversation and making it a totally transparent thing. So the NDAA, in fact, does hold within it these emergency rules, which, like I said, every president has been signing since Bush put them into effect in the first place, because the idea of government giving something up, giving some power and control back, that just never happens, apparently. What else you got?
I know you're trying to make this a coherent show, but people are all over the place.
Yeah.
Okay, so Sky Balancer wants to know, what is DJ's opinion on 9/11? Does he believe it was an inside job? I don't think I've ever heard him on that.
Well, you know, I did a series of very interesting interviews with Dr. Joseph Farrell on what he thought had happened there, and also with Jim Mars, and of course, Professor Scott. The interview that we did in 2015 had a lot of 9/11 in it. There's no, you know, anyone who looks at it now with that kind of 2020 hindsight, it's very clear that whatever took place, they hid the real story. In many ways, it was a reenactment of the Kennedy assassination, because they put together the 9/11 Commission, very much like the Warren Commission, which was there to find a predetermined results, which was, don't worry, you know, it was just some bad actors who planned this out in a cave. No, the United States has very strict rules about airspace, and they developed them during the Cold War because of nuclear tensions. And there's no evidence that they were ever taken off that kind of alert. As a matter of fact, at any given time, they have these things called Doomsday planes, which are flying around in case we get into a nuclear situation, and they're ready to roll. So the idea that you could have an entire government air force stand down during an attack is absurd. And the fact that we got ourselves into this and that the media bought us into that absurd narrative is really difficult. But I think when you look at it, it's very interesting, the parallels between how they covered things up. And if you want to look for the heart of the deep state, you'll find it in places like the JFK assassination or the attacks of 9/11, because they're so well covered up that they take years and years to unravel. But I don't think that, you know, there's so many ridiculous things that happen. I'll give you one example, and it includes Rumsfeld, which is during the attack on the Pentagon, Rumsfeld comes out and he's carrying a stretcher. Well, actually, there are rules against that. When you're the defense secretary, you an act of war has taken place. They have ways and means of getting you to the president, getting you into planning scenarios. So when you're on the lawn of the Pentagon getting a photo op with the stretcher, you know that the whole thing has been predetermined. So there's so many unusual things from the fact that, you know, there's a lot of evidence that a missile hit the Pentagon, not a plane. And, you know, if you're bicycling too close to the Pentagon, they will have security forces on you fast. So the idea that a plane could get that close without somebody shooting it down is absurd. So that we do know. And we also know that there's huge anomalies after the fact, and there's a number of deaths associated with 9/11. So when they go to cover these things up, they have to kind of tidy the situation up by getting rid of those people. So yes, clearly 9/11 was the act of the deep state, and that's what we're talking about tonight.
Right. Building 7.
That's all
I
yes.
need to know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So David Tormita, again, DJ, wasn't it Richard Pearl who outlined 9/11 in the Project for a New American Century, who was also a member of the Safari Club?
That's true.
Good one.
Well, that's PNAC.
Yes.
And what they said was that there would need to be a catalyzing event. They actually ran a full-page ad in the New York Times in 1999. So that's 2 years before it happens. And they said there need to be a new catalyzing event that would take place that would force this to happen. You know, a new Pearl Harbor is what they called it. And if you read what they're saying, it is very predictive, and it makes you wonder about what was in store for us. But interestingly enough, as we touch through these events, we're kind of working through Watergate, through the JFK assassination, 9/11, the Safari Club. We're seeing the same players show up in different ways. And we're seeing that whoever it is, you know, you might not have somebody in 2001 who was there during the Kennedy administration, because there's 40 years difference, but you're seeing personnel from the emergency powers continuity of government aspect. Now, I've pointed out that Rumsfeld and Cheney were deep in that planning in the 80s, and Ollie North was, and President Bush was. He was vice president then. So the idea there is they changed the rules a little bit in the 80s, and this is an important change. Originally, they were set up to have something where, in the case of a nuclear emergency, they'd have the secondary government ready to roll, and they'd have these emergency martial law powers. They changed the rule to be any emergency, and that's where they were able to use it on 9/11, even though there was nothing nuclear about it. So they were able to utilize these rules. They wanted to see what would happen. They wanted to go into position about what would happen in a live martial law scenario. Now, you could say with 9/11, well, they didn't really have martial law, right? But they enacted these emergency powers that give them the ability to do that. And that's what we're still living under. And that's why we have things, like JSOC, for example, the Joint Special Operations Command, who, very interestingly, they do utilize that X-steganography. It's quite clear. What I find when I look at these is that it is continuity of government that is going to give us answers around the secret space program, around the deep state activities, around the players on the intelligence side. Now, I'm going to list here for you some people involved in continuity of government. And this is very interesting because as we go down the line and look at them, oh, that's the shot I wanted to show earlier. That is Prescott, Bush, and Nixon. And that is a little bit like, you're a chop off the old block. Mm-hmm. There you go. So let's take a look at this list of people who are associated with continuity of government, who also will be involved in all these deep events. Number 1, John Dean. John Dean, who, as Nixon's lawyer, should have been able to assert executive privilege for anything that took place. And that would have left, without John Dean's testimony, they couldn't get Nixon. That's a fact. Instead, he gives them the exact tools they need to remove Nixon. So John Dean, previous to that, had been a continuity of government planner. That was his job. He was in charge of continuity of government planning at the Pentagon. Okay, that's John Dean. Next up, Winston Lawson, Secret Service agent. This is interesting. Another Secret Service person pops up. This is a picture of Winston Lawson here. Winston Lawson has an interesting, very, very interesting thing to his credit. He's the one who planned the trip for the Dallas trip. He planned the motorcade route for President Kennedy to go by the Texas School Book Depository. Now, Lawson, before, during, and after the assassination, was utilizing what? The emergency communications channel through the White House. That's COG. So he's using this communications network. There's no reason to be using it before the assassination, but he uses it before, during, and after. He is another person who, again, we're finding deeply involved with continuity of government. What I want to make a little note on this, which is these things come out over time, which is why I always say that it's important to study the cases in history, because a lot of the black operations will unravel over about, decades. And when we try to really solve them in the moment, it's difficult to get the full picture. And the more that we can kind of connect these dots, the better, I think, off we're going to be. So this came out now in 2017. It may be one of the most significant things that came out in the JFK records dump. And it's that the Dallas mayor who helped Winston Lawson set up the motorcade route was a CIA asset. Now, Earl Cabell was the mayor of Dallas during that period, but no one ever knew that he was an actual CIA asset. Interestingly enough, his brother was named General Cabell, and he was Dulles' deputy, and Kennedy fired them both. So, I guess we had some inkling that he was connected to the CIA, but the idea that the mayor who set up the route with the Secret Service agent who's part of COG or this Doomsday network, then they're setting up the route for the assassination. Everyone who's ever looked at it, who's involved in security, or the kind of military detail looking at it, saying, why would they ever have anyone go make a weird turn, where he's open to fire from 3 different directions? So that'll give you some kind of revelations, and that is a historic release when you think about it. One of the things that the DA, Jim Garrison, pointed out was that the people involved in the assassination were centered in the aerospace industry. This is what the conclusion that he came to, that there was something inside of the aerospace wing of the military-industrial complex that had kind of ordered the assassination and executed it. This is very important because when we talk about continuity of government on one side, we understand it in terms of those underground bases and there's a covert government operating. On this program, we've done a lot of coverage on the secret space program, and that's all about what's going on up there in space. And a lot of people have said, well, how would they get away with building all this stuff in space? And basically, if you operate those rules that are in effect for continuity of government, and you just turn that around and say, well, now in space, those rules are also operative, then that's it. It's a done deal. So that's how you would get a secret space program that no one would know anything about. And it makes sense, because what doesn't make sense is when you look at, since 1972, this great space program that we developed never sent a man back to the moon again. So it's 50 years later. And it's kind of absurd when you think about it. They're talking about all these plans now, but there's no explanation for why they haven't done anything in space in 50 years except launch probes. So, and it's not the money. So that ain't it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist program. We're here on X Series 77, the episode X Steganography, the Deep State X-Operatives Doomsday Network. One of the key factors, I think, when we look at this, and it's going to take a few episodes to really unravel these players, but as we're seeing, just like we saw in the Lewis Bloomfield Papers episodes that we're doing at the end of the year, there are these stealth archives that are there and that we know we're going to get our hands on. So there's a court case there over Bloomfield's papers when the Canadian Archives is still holding on to them, when even Bloomfield himself had specified, well, these should come out. There's the X letter at the LBJ Library, due to be released in 2023. There's Eisenhower's X time capsule. That is a 100-year time capsule. That's 2053. And so there's a number of these time capsules, documents that are going to be public at some point, because these people who were associated with these programs that were very clandestine at the time, some of them relating to the UFO file, they want their place in history. They want to be there, stand up, take notice. So it's very important, I think, for us to kind of keep that in mind as we go along here, which is these stealth archives are coming into focus, and we know that they're there. We can't get our hands on them yet, but we are starting to see this process. And it's interestingly enough, in my conversations with Douglas Caddy, who's the Watergate lawyer, in speaking about Robert Merritt's activities with President Nixon and all the things that were associated with this, information that Nixon wanted to keep hidden, that's the information that's supposed to be coming forward. That's his version. That's Nixon's time capsule, as we've done the shows on. So Nixon had that role also in relation to this. So he understood. But side by side with these players and their place in history is something else. And it is this kind of deep state aspect. And how they get that power and how they're able to utilize it comes through this channel of continuity of government planning. And we're going to see that crucial people, as I've pointed out, who are associated with these deep events over and over again, like 9/11, Rumsfeld Cheney, like Winston Lawson with JFK, and like John Dean with Watergate, over and over again, we see that they're associated with it. Now, one of these came out recently, as recently as 2013, but it's quite interesting because it wasn't on the record before, And I want to point this out. But before I do, I'm going to turn to you, Miss Olivia. How are you doing out there?
Great. I'll tell you, David Tormina is winning the contest tonight, the question contest. Okay, so I'm going to go straight to it.
Yes.
DJ, even though we know the Deep State has created a spacefaring secret society, isn't the real threat to them the use of X technology to free up humanity?
Yeah, well, it's very interesting, isn't it? Because if you had a secondary source, for example, we wouldn't be sitting here debating things like why are they trying to start a war with Iran, right? Because it wouldn't be so important if they were using a secondary source. Because obviously the troubles in the Middle East are fueled predominantly by oil. I mean, it's obvious because we didn't have that many strategic interests there. And then there's, certainly in relation to Israel and all that, there are those, but really predominantly we're talking about oil issues when you get to the Middle East, pipeline issues, resources. So if you had a secondary energy source that threw us off the oil paradigm, there's no question that a number of those issues would just fade out on the spot. So therefore, the answer to your question, I guess, would be yes. Straight up. That's an easy one. Norman Katz. Let's look at another one here. And I did remind everyone that in the second part, coming up here actually now, probably in the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to be taking your questions. We've been taking them along the way, but ask them all in caps and Olivia will run them through. Okay. Now, let's read this, Norman Katz. By the way, Norman Katz lives really close by. If he's still alive. That's a good question. I need to check that out. Norman Katz, former military attaché to the U.S. Secret Service Continuity of Government Program. About Norman. Here we go with Secret Service and continuity of government again. We've seen it with Winston Lawson and in relation to some of Sim's activities. We're going to see it. Here's a few things. Norman was in Dallas in the Presidential Secret Service detail on the day of the assassination. He was not part of the caravan detail, but was at the Dallas headquarters in the backup detail. Quote, this is Norman himself speaking. I was supposed to go to Dallas that day, Katz said Friday by phone from his home in Massachusetts, in Sharon, Massachusetts. But the Secret Service was expecting Dallas to be tense, if not dangerous. Because Katz had a special training in security that would ensure the continuity of the U.S. government, he was told to stay in Washington. I'm going to read that again. I was supposed to go to Dallas, Katz said Friday by phone from his home in Sharon, but the Secret Service was expecting Dallas to be tense, if not dangerous. Because Katz had special training in security that would ensure the continuity of the U.S. government, he was told to stay in Washington. So they're thinking they're going to need the COG person who was part of the Secret Service detail. That day I was at the office, a teletype came right through. We knew immediately. Although not tense enough to find a single threat in Dallas at the time. Obviously, these guys, the Secret Service had a number of threats submitted to them. Watch this guy, watch that guy. But the person who was not on their list was Lee Harvey Oswald, because the CIA had removed him from the list 6 weeks earlier because in Professor Scott's lingo, he was the designated culprit and they didn't want anybody messing with him before the job was done. And in Oswald's case, he just had to sit there. Another COG person, continuity of government, James McCord. He was in charge of military coordination for continuity of government. But James McCord is also the CIA agent who got caught with the Watergate burglars. Interestingly enough, James McCord was born in Waurika, Oklahoma. Sims is also from Oklahoma, interestingly enough. He was in the U.S. Army Air Corps, and he worked as special intelligence operations against German spies. McCord became a member of the Central Intelligence Agency in 1951. He worked the Physical Security Division in 1962. McCord became a CIA senior security officer in Europe. This included working closely with MI5 in England. Later, he was given responsibility for security at Langley CIA headquarters. McCord retired from the CIA in August 1970. Then he shows up coordinating the Watergate burglars. So this is very interesting because there's another player from COG who's involved in this deep event of Watergate. So whatever it was that was happening there at Watergate, the continuity of government players were thick in the midst. Let's go back to Norman Katz for a moment, who I just described. Norman Katz was the youngest of only a few associates still alive working with the U.S. Secret Service who served as a government advisor on the day of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. As I pointed out, Abraham Bolden is still alive. He served as military attaché to the U.S. Secret Service in the Continuity of Government program and was on duty at the White House in the Military District of Washington, D.C. The assassination of President Kennedy in Dallas, Texas on November 22, 1963 remains one of the most iconic and shocking moments of the 20th century. Norm is the only former military attaché to the U.S. Secret Service special agent still living who gives speaking presentations on the continuity of the U.S. government in times of disasters. These players from continuity of government in the CIA, in the Secret Service, in White House Counsel, they are spread around through government and they can coordinate in a heartbeat, and they usually do. So when we look at the continuity of government players like Cheney and Rumsfeld and Bush, who set it up in the 1980s to be continuity of government, the version without the nuclear consideration, just any emergency, then this Doomsday Network takes on a real kind of specter by the time you get to 9/11, because they actually use the rules during the 9/11 incident, and now we're under those continuity of government rules. So fundamentally, it seems like as Americans, we're not aware enough of this continuity of government power. And I'll give you some ideas here now. Oliver North, who did some of that predominantly in the 80s, he was the main person who did it. And he set up something called Rex 84. And Flashpoint was another one, but these were intelligence gathering operations. Rex 84 was a plan to round up American citizens in the event of unrest, literally martial law plan. And it's easy to look up now, Rex 84. And Flash Forward is another one. But you can see that this is what they're thinking, that they need a plan for martial law and that they want to execute a plan for martial law. So it's very interesting when you look at people like North, who got into trouble for using the continuity of government communications, emergency communications network, to set up the deals in Iran with sending missiles over to Iran. It's very interesting because upon reflection 30 years later, it's quite fascinating that when he goes to bring it up and he says, let's talk about the work that I was doing at the time with the Special Emergency Network Continuity of Government program, the senator from Hawaii, Daniel Inouye, stands up and says, you can't talk about that in open session, only in closed session. Don't say anything else. That's where we are in terms of continuity of government. There's nothing on the public record that they can give us about it, but we live under its rules. So this is a large imbalance, and this was where the kind of deep state X-operatives, these things that we're talking about, really kind of come into overdrive. So the continuity of government, I think we have a better idea now, taking a look at this, the players over the course of 60 years now who have been utilizing this secret power, which is completely unreachable by traditional democratic, congressional House terms. Yes.
All right, let's play with COG for a minute. Okay, so TJ Liberty Bell was asking $1 million question. Why is continuity of government so urgent? I think you're alluding to that right there with
Absolutely.
Martial law. Can we go into that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, well, one of the things you have to think about in terms of its traditional setup is that what happens very often in fascist activity or in deep state activity is that you piggyback on top of something that should be happening. So, for example, in the example of when we bombed this general, ordinarily, if there were a terrorist threat against Americans and you took out the terror cell that was doing it, we would understand that as a good thing to do. But when you can't, when you say there's an imminent threat and then you can't prove it and then you kill them anyway, that you can see they're piggybacking on top of rules that are there. By the way, that's an international violation by any stretch of the imagination to just kill the leader of another country, especially if you're not at war with them. I mean, it is a war act. So, we used to, a lot of the congressional committees that you look at in the 70s and 80s who dealt with these things, they were looking to prosecute people for planning to assassinate world leaders. In the CIA, they were trying to assassinate Castro, for example. This was the crime. But as we can see the other day, under these emergency powers rules that were granted after 9/11 when COG became activated, they were able to just say there's an imminent threat. I don't like this guy. I'm going to drop a bomb on him. So you can see that this is the nature of the situation. And so we need the discussion to be, what are the emergency powers rules? Where are we at with continuity of government? And are you trying to suspend the Constitution every time you used it? Because certainly going to war without going to the Congress first is a violation of the Constitution anyway. Second, the War Powers Act that was enacted after the Nixon-Watergate administration said you're not going to be able to do this. It restrains you from doing it. And so the horrible thing about the situation that Pompeo got Trump into is the very same people who were trying to maneuver him out of office with this impeachment push now become right when they say, we want to restrain you through Congress from doing anything on your own in Iran. That's correct. So Pompeo turned the Trump foreign policy into something that could be dismantled like this. And he's led him down a very illegal path. And if he keeps going down there, it's going to be the end of the Trump administration. So you can see the urgency around getting rid of Pompeo. Yes.
Danielle Jorgensen says COG is imperative for the new space government.
Well, see, this is this is the COG and SSP. I did a lecture actually for something called Ireland Awakens, and I called it COG, SSP and COG, which is the Secret Space Program and the Continuity of Government Program. Now, with the Space Force, we can see some of those factors around the Secret Space Program becoming public, but not the history of what we've been doing the last 50 years. And that's because the Continuity of Government Program is keeping us under, kind of a dome of secrecy when you think about it. Now, that kind of transparency that we could get by unraveling that, just like when we go into look at the space program, instantly they said, well, we make it a war-fighting domain. This is another mistake that the Trump administration made. This doesn't make any sense to me because we have treaties in space, and it says you can't put weapons of mass destruction up there. So it's not a war-fighting domain, in fact. So the Trump administration announced it that way. And then, oddly enough, when you really look at what they did with it, they just sort of kind of pushed it through. But they announced the first branch of the armed services since the Air Force. So it's pretty major, and it requires, a very intense, robust discussion, critique, and approval process, not just rushing it through with the NDAA. So that's what they did. And Democrats approved that, even though they, want to take Trump's hide off, they approved of that whole process. So they're playing right into the problem. So that would be my answer on that. Let's.
I want to ask one more follow-up question. Okay, so something I'm concerned about with the gun grabs. How do you see COG and martial law playing out there?
Yeah, well, this is interesting because I think they've organized it, when you look at things like the push that they have for mandatory vaccines, for example, and you've seen this big battle play out in New Jersey recently where they're removing the religious exemption, and they got intense pushback, but they went for it anyway. I think when you see that the beat down, as it's called, and as I'll refer to it today, then, that's anti-constitutional. One, it's un-American. too. It's the whole freedom of choice and freedom of speech. And 3, it's a desperate act because the control around these things, like the danger of vaccines, for example, along with the medical information that's out there in relation to this, the idea that you're going to shut down open debate about these things and you're going to give the vaccine companies a complete clemency from being sued is absurd. But we've done that since 1986, and the reason we did it was because there were so many vaccine manufacturers that were getting sued that a lot of the companies said, we're just not going to do it. So they gave them all immunity, and this is the nature of the situation that we're in. But like any pharmaceutical drug, the vaccines need to be tested for safety. And if they do result in injury, then the citizens need to have the ability to respond in kind, and they need a mechanism to be able to sue those companies. So therefore, the disconnection from reality, and one of the things that Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's been a great, kind of giving us the facts on this one. He's a great leader on giving us the awareness on this and really fighting the pharmaceutical companies. The thing that he points out literally is that they have 300 of these in the pipeline. They want to continue to roar this down on people for profit. And also, it seems like there's a deeper purpose involved also. We've speculated on that before. But I would say that it comes to a point where what good is your citizenship if you can be pumped, and you and your children can be pumped full of questionable, medicine, right? So we come into, it's getting to a real clash there. And so when you get to the whole gun grab idea, they've been out for that for so long, but it's very difficult in America. But it seems to me that fundamentally where they failed there, they're trying to succeed with vaccines. And when people's, there's an intense media hypnosis going on this, trying to say that anyone who questions any of it is anti-science and all that. It's not true. You have some great scientists and doctors on board talking about the hazards of this, just like in anything there would be hazards. So the idea of the pharmaceutical companies controlling the narrative on this is so out of hand. So it's going to have, it's one of those major issues. It should be on the table in the 2020 election. And if it was a Democrat, a Republican, or a Libertarian who was talking about it, I'd listen to them. I wouldn't care about the party, and I wouldn't care about the person. And frankly, I have to say this on the board too. But if Trump turns into a World War III bombing guy who's just out to, promote neocon interests, he's not going to find any support on this show. And the funny thing is that when we look at people across the board, the parties, it doesn't matter. The point is, what are they going to do? That's all that counts at the end of the day. And the parties long ago sold out as parties. So can you get them to pay attention to the issues that are important? Catherine Fitz would say that missing trillions are important. One, the personal liberty people would tell you that the vaccine issue is very important. 5G is another one. So we are facing all these. We're coming into that clash in 2020. There's no question about it.
Actually, 5G is really important because when people start really getting sick from that, and we could seriously have a health crisis, and then they can have martial law, to control us.
Oh, there's no question about it. They could manufacture a crisis. The next deep crisis could be some kind of...
Well, it's probably the Ebola vaccine, as we all know. No, I'm serious.
I know. I absolutely
Bill
agree.
Gates's Ebola vaccine.
This is the problem. Yeah, it's problematic. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here taking on everything, it seems like. We're going
It's that
deep.
kind of a night.
It's deep tonight.
So before we shift gears.
Wait, hold on. Keep it hold for a second. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. It's a free newsletter, but it keeps you in the loop, especially with all the social media shutdown that we've been seeing. That's the next thing. The censorship is so hardcore. But this is kind of a direct pipeline with you and I to stay in touch that way. So make sure that you are signed up for it. Anyone who's watching this program should be signed up for the newsletter because it's free. The other thing to do is to take the time to subscribe to Dark Journalist, promote the work that we're going to be doing for you in 2020. We're going deep. There's so much happening with the Hot Zone. There's so much happening with these events that are coming up, and some incredible, and I do mean incredible, guests that are going to be on the show for you, and you're going to want access to all of that. So we've made it very easy for you to become a member or stay a member. And Miss Olivia, what do you got?
TJ Liberty Bell had a follow-up. Could this all be a means to a specific end to redefine property law? Basically, does the state own us and our children, for example? Right?
Well, I like Catherine Fitz on this because she said, one of the problems that we have is that the average citizen doesn't understand that the people in leadership believe in slavery.
Mm.
This is a really big problem, one way or another. So the U.S. Constitution gives us that independence. So when they go to do things like, well, we'll have a constitutional convention, or, we'll make North America an economic zone along with Mexico and Canada, but it's the American Constitution that gives us the freedom. And so just like in these situations, like we've had with Trump and this war push for Iran, I suggest the people in that administration who want to make war with Iran go and read the Constitution, because they don't have the ability under the Constitution to do that. And they can't take out leaders of other countries just because, they decide it's the time to do that. So it doesn't work that way. And so on the other side, the Democrats, in their position to try to eliminate Trump at any cost, I would go back to them and say, forget about your impeachment and go read the Constitution, because you don't have the ability to do that. And you can't just sort of stick the charges on and as a partisan thing try to get somebody out. And I would say to the Central Intelligence Agency, you can't select who is president, as you've tried to do. And when Trump got in there, they did try to eliminate him. They seem a little more easygoing with him now, and that makes me nervous. Okay. Let's do this. I do want to round out a couple of things in terms of our overall emphasis in the episode. So let's just grab a little bit of Hinckley for this so we understand it again. Well, this is interesting because Ronald Reagan ran against Jimmy Carter in 1980. And Carter was saddled by the Iranian hostage crisis. Now, recently, President Trump said, I'm going to destroy 52 of your historic sites. People were like, what is that number 52 that he's referring to? Well, 52 was the number of Iranian hostages that were taken. So it's like, I'm going to enact some weird old revenge on you from 40 years ago. Very, very unusual. And by the way, under Geneva Conventions and everything else, you can't go bomb somebody's historic sites intentionally. It's in international law, it's recognized as a crime. So they did back off of that language, but how strange that language ever got out there in the first place. I think that we have to acknowledge here that if you talk to a country like that, what you say, being president, could be taken as a provocation. So therefore, you're leading us into war by the way that you're talking. So therefore, people in the Trump administration need to get a handle on the message, one, and on the messenger. And the people who support Trump, this is very important, I think, too. The independent media, it was said, supported Trump 93%. So it's 9 out of 10. And so they were an important bloc in the voters that they reached and all the rest of it. So those people, like here on this program, can reach this administration by saying, you're not going to get support from those people if you are going to war with Iran. So decide what you want to do, because you're going to trade off all that support, and maybe Bibi Netanyahu is going to be happy, but you're not going to be happy if you lose the election to, I don't know, Elizabeth Warren. Let's go ask her. She lives close by too. I don't know. We're surrounded by them. Okay, so let's get into the Reagan assassination. 1980, he's running, and he wins in a landslide against Carter, who was saddled by the Iranian crisis. And Carter, at the last minute, really big mistake, decides to debate Reagan. And that does it, because before that, the polls are kind of close, but then Reagan demolishes him in the debate. And also, Reagan's not the crazy nuclear bomber guy that they all think he is going to be. Now, in March, after getting inaugurated in January, Reagan is shot. And
wait, when is he shot?
In March. Yeah.
Wow, that's pretty fast.
Yeah, it's pretty fast.
Mm-hmm.
And George Bush is hanging around there waiting in the wings. George Bush is on a plane and basically ready to take over. And he's getting to hear, okay, the president's shot. So when he lands, he might be president. It's possible. And this is where, in the famous thing, Alexander Haig, since Bush is in the air and Reagan's in the hospital, Alexander Haig, who's the chief of staff, says, I'm in charge, like, so no, you're not. But anyway, Reagan got shot there, and it's always been a very unusual story because basically it seems like the same forces that convinced Reagan to take Bush on his ticket, because he originally didn't like him, because Bush had said, what you want is voodoo economics, and they were very bitter enemies during the campaign. But there were a lot of political forces that said, if you don't have Bush, we can't support you. So they wanted Bush in there, and they had decided to roll out the old, we're going to assassinate them out of office and put our guy in, the same way they did with Johnson under Kennedy. So what we got instead was this kind of, Reagan survived barely, but he was impaired for a while there. And in fact, Bush became super dominant for a long stretch of time, and eventually took over a number of these things, and like the COG, for example. The person who shot him was another one of these figures, John Hinckley Jr. John Hinckley Jr., in this whole kind of wave of assassinations that happened. Remember, Anwar Sadat was assassinated. They tried to assassinate the Pope. And then we also had Mark David Chapman, who assassinated John Lennon on December 8th, before Reagan was inaugurated. All that happened in a very short period of time. It was just like a wave of assassinations. And what's incredible about it is that Mark David Chapman and John Hinckley Jr. shared something in common. But first, let's think about the fact that Hinckley was related to a major Bush donor, a Republican oil family, and the Hinckleys were a very powerful family. And in fact, George Bush had plans to have dinner with his father in 2 nights later. So there were so many stories. NBC News and all the rest of it were like, assassin knew Bush's family. It's very unusual. Can you imagine, like, Trump gets assassinated and the assassin is a close friend of the Pences? I mean, it would raise a lot of red flags.
Now everybody would see through it.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
But the story that they gave Hinckley, which was different from these other assassins, was that he was obsessed with Jodie Foster, and that in order to impress her, he was going to kill the president. Now, he had a very unusual background in that his father ran something called the World Vision Church, and they sent missionaries all over the world, including to places like Turkey, Beirut, and war-torn countries. Interestingly enough, when I went into the history of Mark David Chapman, he also had a religious organization sponsoring him through the YMCA to go to all these countries. So these assassins you will find, like Mark David Chapman, who, by the way, worked as a security guard and didn't seem to have any money in his checking account, but he was going all over the world, to China and to Beirut. In that period, it would be like going to North Korea now. Just unbelievable. You could get in and out of there. But he also, Hinckley Jr., also, as part of this World Vision Church, he went all over the world. So this is how they can kind of get them off American soil and work this magic on them. Interestingly enough, the same story that they tried with Mark David Chapman about him getting obsessed with Catcher in the Rye and reading the book and all the rest of it. They had this set up because when they got Hinckley and they got to his house, he also had the Catcher in the Rye. So it was like he was borderline. They might have been saying, well, maybe we can use this off with him. But interestingly enough, Chapman, as I mentioned, he actually got out of prison recently, which is very unusual for a presidential assassin to be, and he's no longer incarcerated. But a few things that we know about Hinckley is that because of his association with this World Vision religious organization, he was subject to this kind of intense MKUltra mind control. And a lot of these assassins, when we really take a good look at them, all the way from Oswald and Sirhan, they all have this kind of hypnotic training going on. So I wanted to take a quick look here at Fort Holabird real briefly, which is where a lot of this training took place and where a lot of our leading figures in this story, like Agent Sims and Nagell and all the rest of it, come together. And then we're going to take your questions. Now, Miss Olivia, in the meantime, what have we got there?
Robert Ayala wanted to know, is Permindex responsible for the Reagan assassination attempt?
Well, see, Permindex broke up after Garrison exposed it. So technically it was gone. However, organizations like BCCI took over that role of money laundering and funding assassinations. So that's where you go. You move your eyes from Permindex to BCCI, and you'll have some of those answers.
Ronan Returns wanted to know, Catcher in the Rye, CIA calling card or programming?
No question. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like Alice in Wonderland. Mm-hmm. And it's really fascinating. We've done some things on the author, but he has, in that book, this whole kind of idea of like lost childhood and these things, this sense that he's the catcher and he's catching people. It makes the programming is to make the person feel heroic, in a sense that he's saving the children. But we can see what's interesting, whenever we go back into that case of Mark David Chapman, who actually was sitting there reading the book when the police showed up and reading out loud from it. When he was wandering around there, he wrote in his diary, made an entry, and he said, actually, what am I even doing in New York? I don't even know why I'm here. I'm going home. And he was planning to go home. And he bumped accidentally into James Taylor. James Taylor, what's his famous song? I'm Your Handyman. And he had this very unusual encounter, and James Taylor recounted it and said, it was strange because he started to implode, like he started to shake and kind of freak out, almost as if his programming got triggered early, or he got triggered back into the programming. And
You mean because he was meeting like a rock star?
Yes.
Oh, that's fascinating.
And James Taylor ran away from him.
Wow, I had no idea.
Yeah, it is really remarkable. And when we go deep into that, I want to say this because today is the anniversary of David Bowie's passing 4 years ago. And Bowie was an extraordinary person. His music is incredible. I've always enjoyed it my whole life. And I was lucky enough to meet Bowie on 2 different occasions, which is off the charts, in my opinion. And he was great, really fantastic, smart and very
full electric.
Yeah, very charming guy. And it's kind of fascinating because he was doing The Elephant Man in New York at the time that John Lennon was shot by Chapman. But when they got Chapman's book, he had this list, like they always have a list. Well, if I don't get Nixon, I'll go Kennedy, or I'll get, like the next guy they're going to find. It'll be like, I tried to get Trump, but instead I got, Mitch McConnell. But interestingly enough, in that book in that listing, Bowie was in that listing of rock stars to knock off, in a sense. In fact, Mark David Chapman had been triggered to get Lennon. So the list is a fraud, but nonetheless, he was on there. And they wanted to get rid of Lennon because Lennon was coming out of retirement, and there was kind of a leftover contract from when Lenin was so politically active and so politically destructive that they did not want him leading anti-nuclear protests because they wanted a huge nuclear buildup. And that's largely, in my opinion, that's largely the reason they got rid of Lenin. But interestingly enough, Bowie, when he was performing The Elephant Man, he had given the Lennons, John and Yoko, front row seats for that night after the assassination. And he did the entire performance looking at those two empty seats, realizing, John Lennon was dead and Yoko obviously wasn't there. And then the next day, the police told him that he was on this list that they had found. And in fact, Bowie didn't do the Scary Monsters tour in 1981 because of this. And he said that, he realized something, which was that we have to do something about the problem we have here on planet Earth, because he was close to Lennon, and to see him just gunned down like that was just so much. But it really altered a number of things there. But the combination of those circumstances. So yeah, we all are very sad that David Bowie passed away in a relatively young age, and it's a great loss, really, musically. So his music does live forever. Okay, Miss Olivia.
Contiki Man wanted to know, and I did too, who took over after BCCI?
Well, you've got Enron. It's interesting because I think that a lot of the financial institutions that we look at, and JP Morgan and all the rest of it, it seems like they've consolidated, and that a lot of these middlemen operations were kind of suited their times in that way. But I think that we still do see with those scandals that come out, there was this whole wave of bankers that were eliminated, and they just got, well, this guy jumped out a window, this guy decided to kill himself, this guy, for some weird reason, hung himself upside down. Like they would do all these bizarre things to these bankers. And I had a conversation with Catherine Fitz about it. I said, what do you think is going on here? And she said, well, I think they're deleting databases. And this is what it comes down to. When you see that type of activity, that money laundering and drug laundering is going on. Okay, what else do we have here? A couple of quick things. Fort Holabird. Can't leave the presentation without Fort Holabird. Here we go. Are you ready? Chronology of U.S. Army Intelligence, U.S. Chemical Corps experiments on LSD. The code name was EA 1729. I don't know what that means, but I'm going to look into it. 1950, LSD is considered by Army as a method for interrogation and also for defense against enemy interrogation. Chemical Warfare Laboratories, Edgewood Arsenal. This was the kind of liaison place in relation to Fort Holabird. Okay, Fort Holabird, remember, right outside Baltimore, Maryland. This is where they trained in military intelligence and MKUltra. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Army Intelligence, Fort Holabird, 1956 to 57, combined with Army Chemical Corps, Edgewood Arsenal for LSD tests. Tests included many other chemicals, also included LSD, electrode implants. That's a good way to control somebody. They don't have to do that so much anymore. Now you just put a chip in. Doses as high as 1,600 micrograms, normal LSD, street level, 160 micrograms. Think about that. So a hit of acid is 160 micrograms. They were giving people 1,600. So this is very, very deep level. The height of LSD testing, March 1958, used on memory impairment, motor reaction, effects on isolation, stress under LSD. Can only imagine those. Ready to be used for operational advantage in 1958. 1959, conclusions, LSD test rewarding. This is directly out of the U.S. Army Intelligence Report. Quote, it's recommended that actual applications of LSD be utilized in real situations on an experimental basis. Army field instructions for G2 administration of LSD told to coordinate with FBI and CIA. CIA, Army Intelligence, U.S. Chemical Corps working together, December 1960. So they're definitely they're at this level now where they're integrating techniques. They have MKUltra techniques, they have LSD. So the mind control level that they have is off the charts. So when we see these programmed assassins roll out on the stage, you know, we have kind of these deep state X-operatives on a high level and a low level, because you look at somebody like Sims, and he's coming out and he is being used in all these deep events. So he's one kind of operative, but the other kind of operative, the kind of Nagell operative, or let's say Thomas Valley, you know, this is the macrocosm, microcosm, and I think it's important we can connect the dots easier if we look at it this way. A couple of quick things about this. Jim Keith, who was a fantastic author who died very young and died under suspicious circumstances when he was exposing a CIA program. He also did some great books about the Men in Black also. But he wrote about Fort Holabird in Maryland. Let's see what he had to say. Although it's been a carefully guarded secret, Nazi scientists were involved in the Army and CIA psychochemical experiments conducted on American enlisted men at the Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland and at Army Intelligence Base at Fort Holabird, Maryland. This was the beginning of the CIA's MKUltra mind control projects. MKUltra was right there in the heart of Fort Holabird, and we find Secret Service operator Louis Sims, people connected with COG, right there at Fort Holabird. So these people, it's interesting, they may be not only utilizing the techniques to create Manchurian candidates, but they might be themselves. You know, somebody like Sims could be programmed throughout. And so when we look at this kind of MKUltra and the way that they did it, remember they destroyed most of the records of what it was all about in the first place. Now think of the incredible digital technology that has grown and into something called MKUltra and entrainment and all the rest of it. And this gives us that feel that their powers, the reason that they're so arrogant with so many of these programs, is they really feel that their powers over the suggestive human mind have reached an all-time level. So if you think they were arrogant here in 1960 at Fort Holabird, well, just think about what they think they can do now. Yes.
Where do you get that term MKUltra?
MKUltra. This is something that I came up with when I was talking with Alana Freeland, because we were talking about the difference.
You mean you coined it?
We just mentioned. I don't think anyone's used it.
I like it.
Well, it makes more sense, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. So let's see. I think we covered that. I want to show a couple of interesting photos in relation to this presentation because I didn't get around to show these earlier. This is Louis Sims walking in to give Judge Sirica, and it says, Alfred Wong left, a deputy assistant director to the United States Secret Service, walks to the U.S. District Court in Washington Friday with Louis B. Sims, a Secret Service agent. Sims is in charge of internal security at the White House. This is where Sims reveals the White House taping system. And later the credit all goes to Butterfield. The historic story is that they left Sims out for some reason. And think about that. Because Sims needed to do more work with Interpol, and he couldn't be known as the guy who had handed over the tapes. But we now have conclusive evidence that he is, in fact, the guy who handed over the tapes. Okay, a little more, just to show everyone. This is Sims to speak at Swosu Sayre graduation, which is a local high school there, talking about how he's the chairman of the EEX Corporation. I love that one. Louis B. Sims, retired Secret Service, remains involved in community service at home in Hobart, Oklahoma. Interestingly enough, Sims would become a member of the board of a private space agency there in the 1980s and 90s, which we don't have time to get into now, but it's the Oklahoma Space Authority Board. So again, this whole kind of picture of him getting grabbed out of nowhere to meet with Truman, the Army grabbing him and bringing him to Fort Holabird, him becoming in charge of the Secret Service, during the Kennedy assassination, disappearing after the Kennedy assassination, and making sure, though, that Abraham Bolden was put in jail, and then reemerging as the person who hands over the tapes that incriminate Nixon to the Watergate Committee, obviously, and then becoming the chief of Interpol and being in South America and the Middle East and everywhere else. This is a very important deep state player, and he is right at that sort of apex, just like a lot of the COG players, as we've mentioned, like Dean, etc. Okay, and that's actually a full-on shot of Louis B. Sims. This guy, although he's passed away, I want to make him very famous because I want to get all the information out there that's on him and get it out to the public, because I have a feeling this is someone who was able to keep a very low profile while working for the deep state in real life. But now that we have all this information on the record, we can rediscover exactly his footprints. And that's the picture of the other Secret Service agent. And he was the one who was partners with our friend there, Sims. Okay, and with that, the last thing I want to show for all this is that Fort Holabird, 5-alarm fire destroyed buildings at Fort Holabird is termed very suspicious. And it happens right after 9/11, oddly enough. And I'll just read briefly. A raging fire that destroyed 2 empty warehouses at Fort Holabird in southeast Baltimore yesterday was very, very suspicious in origin and was probably set. Investigators were still trying late to determine the cause of a 5-alarm fire that burned down buildings once used as centers to train U.S. spies. Nobody was hurt in the fire. The windowless buildings, which had many uses over the year, stood next to the former Army barracks. And what they did was they actually housed the U.S. Army Intelligence Center there after they moved the school, this kind of mind-controlled prep school, to Arizona and Fort Cachuga. So very interesting indeed. What's also interesting is that during the time of Watergate, E. Howard Hunt was housed there. He was basically kept as a prisoner there. So with that, Miss Olivia, it's all about you and your questions that we can get to before we're done.
So Esoteric 369 Wall says Rye Ergot LSD connection, Daniel, hence Catcher in the Rye.
Oh, interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no question about it. Well, again, you're dealing with those kind of hallucinogens, and there's something very deep with Catcher in the Rye. I'm trying to read that book and see how they used
loved that book.
No question about it. Yeah, it's a remarkable piece of literature, but that they would grab that and not like after the fall, like what's the difference? Why were they using that as a mechanism? Why Alice in Wonderland?
Well, I think
example, he
is supposedly telling the story from an insane asylum. From that's it's never.
So you're saying it's to make the assassin look insane?
No, it's that the identification with the lead character. Why can't I think of his name? It's something like Hunter.
Yes.
Is that he is sick. He's in a hospital, recalling all of this. So there's something about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Neurosurgery Highland says the Catcher in the Rye is obligatory read in America's schools. Is this related to mind control? What do you think?
Well, this is an interesting thing because any work can be autonomous, but then be used in this fashion. So, for example, Alice in Wonderland is an incredible esoteric tome. It's rich with esoteric symbolism, but you can obviously distort that symbolism and use it for your own purposes. So I don't think that it had to be written that way, but certainly the way they used it is. I think it's pretty interesting to think about the fact that Hinckley also had the book, and it seemed to be something else that they were going to try to use with him. So we also have a weird thing here where it's always the stuff that they discover after the fact. You remember with Sirhan Sirhan, they discovered all those messages, right? Kennedy must die, and all this. So you have to think that the things that they leave behind, after these people are set off to do their mission, they just kind of stage the incident. So all the things that are left there on purpose, just like the list with Mark David Chapman, and also with Hinckley, the Catcher in the Rye book. Yes.
Right. David Tormina says, DJ, could there be word triggers in Catcher in the Rye? And that's what you're alluding to, really.
It is. That's well, if you remember the original Manchurian Candidate, it was the Queen of Diamonds that was the trigger, and there's no doubt that that's a very interesting mechanism that they were using. But they, with the kind of entrainment ability that they have now, of course, the kind of subliminals that they can have going even through web ads or TV ads is phenomenal, the kind of impact that it can have on an unconscious mind. So certainly word triggers are powerful. Yes.
Mike Roth wanted you to put up the Hinckley and Chapman pics at the same time. So, because they're so similar looking.
I don't have Chapman's picture. This is the thing. But I agree with you. It's very unusual. I think what you're talking about is more the state that they're in starts to reflect. And I noticed this actually. I think I do have his picture here. Yeah, this is the Batman shooter. And, I was looking at before and after pictures with him. And this is another thing where he looked completely different, even like a year and a half earlier. So whatever it is, the training that they go through, I was reading about the Batman shooter's dad. And, it's long been rumored that he was involved. He was a mathematician who was involved with financial analysis.
Right.
And it was long been rumored that he saw something he shouldn't have seen, and that they were able to use his son in this way because the son didn't have this. It's interesting, too, that the son was studying neuromedicine, things like that. So it's very odd what took place there. But when you look at the Batman shooter and you look at people like Sirhan or Hinckley, you see that. It's like the eyes are gone. Just like when they were using the Adam Lanza pictures. It's the same kind of it's like they've been taken out and something else has replaced them, literally. And that's the kind of mind control programming that they're under. I think with Hinckley, Hinckley in particular was under deep mind control, because if you think about the work that his father did with World Vision, they've been controversial before too. They've had various controversies, but that reach worldwide, and the fact of his association with Bush, you really see the kind of player that the Hinckleys were, no question.
Renner Newton made a comment that Mark Zuckerberg basically has the same look in his eyes. I have to admit that's sort of true.
Zuckerberg has more of like the dork sellout look to him.
There is a strange glassiness in the eye. There's, you know what I mean? There's people do have a certain look, and everybody knows that there's something odd there.
Yes.
I will say also that the spooks all have, it's not so much they look the same, but there's a dark aura.
Quality.
You can feel it, you can sense
absolutely.
it, it's obvious.
Everyone, you're watching X Series episode 77. This is where we've gone deep on the X-Operatives and also on the MKUltra Doomsday project. And we're also looking a little bit outside the box when it comes to the assassins themselves, to get some links, some hint of what kind of training they're under. And so when we go all the way back to Fort Holenberg, which is the home of LSD and the development of MKUltra, we can see it starts to fit that pattern. So this idea of the Manchurian Candidate, which was ubiquitous, this movie was supposed to come out in 1963 that they made, the Manchurian Candidate. Oddly enough, Kennedy dies and they shelve that movie, and it comes back out in 66, and it really makes sense. But can you imagine that movie coming out after the Kennedy assassination? Because it's all about this person being programmed to assassinate a presidential candidate. So I think it's very deep when you think of it that way, which is it was in the air at the time. And we've lived over the course of those 50 some odd years with side by side with this deep state apparatus. And one of the things that I didn't get to tonight, but I highly recommend, is if you look at the Dorothy Hunt plane crash, it's very obvious that something has taken place there. One thing I want to mention, which is in a book called The Assassinations. It's edited by Peter Dale Scott. This is a 70s book. But there's a very interesting thing in here that E. Howard Hunt, who of course was the CIA super spy and best friends with Douglas Caddy, also famously went on the record saying, with Caddy, saying that Kennedy was killed over the UFO file because he wanted to share the UFO file. But this is interesting. I just found this combination too good not to share. And this is relating to the shooting of George Wallace in 1972. Quote, this is Gore Vidal writing. Now, for the shooting of George Wallace, it's not unnatural to suspect the White House burglars of having a hand in the shooting, but suspicion is not evidence, and there is no evidence that E. Howard Hunt was involved. Besides, a good CIA man would no doubt have preferred the poison capsule to a gunshot. Slipping old George the sort of slow but lethal dose that Castro's powerful gut rejected. In an AP story this summer, former CIA official Miles Copeland, now this is pretty funny because Miles Copeland is the grandfather of Stuart Copeland, who's the drummer for the Police, and also of his brother who managed the Police and started IRS records. In an AP story this summer, former CIA official Miles Copeland is reported to have said that senior agency officials are convinced Senator Ed Muskie and Senator Edmund Muskie's damaging breakdown during the presidential campaign was caused by convicted Watergate conspirator E. Howard Hunt spiking his drink with a sophisticated form of LSD. This is very fascinating. This was in the mindset of the time. They understood that these tricks were used by the CIA. Now, Muskie was the leading candidate to take on Nixon. He was had a lot more gravitas than McGovern, who completely, tanked. But they were worried about Muskie. But strangely enough, Muskie came out during a press conference when he was running in New Hampshire and started bawling out of nowhere, talking about emotional problems and things like that. And here they were saying that Miles Copeland, who was a CIA official, was saying, actually, this was caused by E. Howard Hunt spiking his drink with LSD. This was fascinating. The methods are understood in that period. It's something that we have to kind of connect, just like we understand certain types of methods now that they're using. This idea that they were programming, that this is what the CIA was about, is very important for us to keep that in mind when dealing with intelligence agencies. They've done so much to rebrand themselves as heroic, but in fact, the Central Intelligence Agency is still an extra-constitutional agency that is far outside of the bounds of traditional law. And, we still have that problem right here in 2020. And, this whole thing about the recent incident with Iran, when we think about Soleimani and all the things that we did to get rid of this guy, and then we think about who had the president's ear on it and who was really pushing it, and it's Mike Pompeo, who was the former director of the CIA and now Secretary of State. These are the types of connections I think we need to make about what are the types of things that this agency is capable of. This is what they've always been capable of, and that's why they shouldn't be making policy or running a UFO program. Yes.
Najat Madri, any chance Lee Harvey Oswald was under MKUltra? I think you could make a case that he had been sexually abused in David Ferrie's unit. What do you think? He was young. He was a teenager.
He was a very interesting guy who he used to call into radio programs, and he had incredible bona fides. And he would talk about being in Ferrie's unit after Oswald had been in Ferrie's unit. And he said, Ferrie could hypnotize me to do anything. So it's pretty interesting when you think about Ferrie. It's known that Ferrie met with Ruby. For years they denied that Ferrie knew Oswald, and then the picture of them in the Civil Air Patrol together came out. But the person I think you can really pin, and this is something that Joseph Farrell got into in his Macrocosm and Medium book, it's really Ruby who appears to be under that kind of control. If anything, what they found with Oswald when they tested him, I believe, was a kind of coolness under pressure that was necessary for him not to blow it, and that they had put him on a mission saying, you're going to actually unravel this plot against the president. Just keep cool. And he had that coolness about him, and he kept looking to be rescued. And, I think that's pretty clear, but Ruby's a very unusual case. He's in an agitated state. And then the reports after he shoots Oswald is that he's calm, totally calm suddenly, and relaxed, and
Well, that's after Oswald's pronounced dead.
Yes.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Right. Exactly. And that's very important, I think. So he is. Yeah. If there's MKUltra involved in that assassination,
there was that
that's
whole
where
thing
it would
about
go.
the cigarette. Right.
Yes.
He didn't smoke.
He said no. Suddenly he said, "Oh, I don't
Mhm.
smoke." There's one more weird thing I want to put on the record about this, which is there's someone named Kerry Thornley, who Jim Garrison was interested in, but he had gone to Atsugi, which is a very secretive CIA base for developing the U-2 in Japan, and Oswald was there also. And Thornley, oddly enough, before Oswald was famous for killing President Kennedy, supposedly, had written a novel about Oswald as a super soldier. So that was very unusual, one. But later years, he would say that he had bunked with Oswald, and that when he was bunking with him over and over again, he could have sworn that he was hearing voices, and they were kind of mechanical voices, and they sounded like commands. Now, it's a very interesting thing that he put on the record there, because that's a kind of voice-to-skull technology, but he was talking about it for 1959. So, God knows how long they've had these things, but they certainly use them now. Yes, Miss Olivia. So we'll take two more questions.
We have to do more than two. I've got too many.
No, we're
so could you go into a little more detail on LSD being replaced by more subtle methods like voice-to-skull technology and other techniques?
Well, there's no doubt that they've developed the ability to control people at a distance. Actually, if you look at the work of Nick Begich, one of the things that he discovered when he was examining HAARP and how that was sort of the HAARP technology, although they shut down HAARP, they used the HAARP technology so much to ionize the atmosphere that, we take it for granted it's included in so many patents. But the original patent is very interesting because it's actually based on a Tesla type technology. But one of the things that Nick Begich pointed out was that there's a whole section in there about how to control the mood of a population by using this ionization of the atmosphere. And then, so the patent itself talks about altering the mood of the citizenry based on the manipulation of the ionization. So obviously, and that research now is from the mid-90s, okay? So we're over 20 years past that. Certainly the things that they can do, and I think that this is very important to point out, and I pointed it out, or Alana Freeland pointed it out in my interview with her over the summer, so I highly recommend that episode. But she was talking about how the technology we have now, the smartphones, et cetera, can pulse us. So with those pulses, they can control a great deal of our physical responses. So there's no doubt we're in very, very deep without a lot of knowledge about what they're doing. And this is the kind of thing that we need to unravel through transparency, things like this program, for example. Yes, Miss Olivia.
David Termina. DJ, weren't the Safari/CIA players directly tied into Reinhard Gehlen's Nazi intelligence service? Can you trace it back?
Well, this is it. I mean, you come to the kind of crux of it, and it is Gehlen's network. Gehlen was basically in charge of the Nazi CIA. And when, we took over, we took Gehlen full scale and said, keep up your operations. Don't ever change. Don't you ever change. And we put him on the payroll, and he just kept up what he was doing. And so Gehlen's network became part of that paperclip network. General Galen techniques were immediately incorporated into the Central Intelligence Agency, and they say that the kind of the fatal flaw of the CIA is taking that in, of actually having that as part of their mandate. But there's so much mind control involved in Galen's work, and this kind of like the kind of treachery of intelligence is embedded in that Nazi technique. So there's no question that it is Galen's network that becomes the fundamental base. I would agree with that, of where so much of this comes from. And that fascist philosophy tie over from post-war Nazis into America has, it's been something that we've tried, I think, through various presidencies like Truman and JFK to get it out. And it has come back. And I think in the 70s, they tried to get it out. And it's deep in there because it's foundational. Now, other countries have their own major issues. Certainly Russia and China, China operates on a total totalitarian basis. So it's interesting. We're talking about the deep state here operating in America, but we can see these tentacles worldwide for sure. So it's kind of fascinating to think about that sort of dispersal of Galen's network. One more question, Miss Olivia.
Okay, before we get to the question, because we have a big crowd, and I wanted to say today is Joseph Farrell's birthday.
Yes.
So we want to wish him a very happy birthday.
I went right up on his Facebook and wished him happy birthday. And he wrote a song which was, "Woe is me, I'm 63." Absurd, of course, because he's doing the best work of his life right now. And he's working on a book currently, and I cannot get what it's about out of him as usual. But as soon as it's out, we're going to have him back on here. But we wish him many more birthdays. And he's still working on the kind of like organ concerto thing too. So there's a lot of really fascinating things coming from Farrell's work. And I'm still trying to keep up. But I went back to Macrocosm and Medium to read it again because there's so much in there about music and mind control and all the rest of it. You could literally, it's amazing to me that he can put out 2 books a year. He's prolific with it, but boy, the books are deep. It's kind of remarkable. Yes.
It's just a quick one. So AJS says, I bet his new book is related to Nazis. Good one. Okay. So final question, big question. Okay. Shamanist Anam Kara. What does it take to end COG? This is the question. How do we get our power back?
Well, this is an interesting thing. I want to read something directly out of I didn't get to Udo Ulfkot either.
Oh, dear God.
I wanted to read something directly out of Peter Scott's book. Where did I put that American Deep State? Is that it? That's it. Yeah. Okay. Well, this kind of gives an answer. So let's see if we get just a little bit of this from Professor Scott. And this is, again, The American Deep State, Wall Street, Big Oil, and the Attack on U.S. Democracy. Quote, it's clear that the Office of Emergency Preparedness, OEP, supplied a common denominator for key personnel in virtually all of the structural events I have discussed. That is, the JFK assassination, 9/11, and all the rest. This is a long way from establishing that the OEP itself, in addition to the individuals I have discussed, was involved in generating any of these events. But I believe that the alternative communications network housed first in the Office of Emergency Preparedness and later part of Project 908. That's very Professor Scott. Do you want to tell us what Project 908 is? Played a significant role in at least 3 of them: the JFK assassination, Iran-Contra, and 9/11. This is the easiest to show in the case of 9/11, where it is conceded that the continuity of government plans of the Doomsday Project were implemented by Cheney on 9/11, apparently before the last of the 4 hijacked planes had crashed. The 9/11 Commission could not locate records of the key decisions taken by Cheney on that day, suggesting that they may have taken place on the secure phone in the tunnel leading to the presidential bunker. With such a high classification that the 9/11 Commission was never supplied phone records, my guess is this was a COG network phone. It is almost certain that the secure phone in the White House tunnel belonged to the Secret Service, and therefore was part of the secure network of the White House Communications Agency, WHCA. If so, it represents a striking link between 9/11 and the JFK assassination. The White House Communications Agency boasts on its website that the agency was a key player in documenting the assassination of President Kennedy. However, it is not clear for whom this documentation was conducted. For the White House Communication Agency logs and transcripts were in fact withheld inexcusably from the Warren Commission and later the House Select Committee on Assassinations. The Secret Service had installed the White House Communications Agency portable radio in the lead car of the presidential motorcade. This in turn was in contact by police radio with the pilot car ahead of it, carrying Dallas Police Department Deputy Chief Lumpkin of the 488th Army Intelligence Reserve Unit. Records of the WHCA communications from the motorcade never reached the Warren Commission, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, or later in the 90s, the Assassination Records Review Board. Thus, we cannot tell if they would explain the anomalies of the two channels of the Dallas Police Department. What he's saying, in effect, is that this network has been in this powerful position since the Kennedy assassination and was utilized again. So it's a clear trail between the JFK assassination in '63 and in 2001 being utilized during 9/11. So it represents literally 4 decades of unchecked power there. So to think about how it's used now, and to think about the situation that we're in with Iran, et cetera, I would say the best answer is to put COG on the table again and to get us out of the emergency state that we've been in since 9/11, which every president signs on to every time they sign the NDAA. It's part of the deal. So that would be kind of the first step, which is to get it as part of the conversation. Absolutely fascinating, everyone. Your questions have been outrageous from the ideas room. And we got into, in this X Series 77, some of the Deep State operatives. And we're going to be bringing more forward on this, of course. It's fantastic to have you all here. And I'm going to shout out to a couple of people that I see out there. David Donaway's out there. Unbelievable. Adam Riddle, it's great to see you. And Esoteric 369 Wall, excellent question tonight. Thank you. Avishai, thank you very much for being out there. Terrific. Johan Wolf, fantastic to see you. Was Modwiz out there? Unbelievable.
Yes, indeed.
Modwiz, Happy New Year. Najat Madri, it's terrific to see you. David Tormina, excellent questions. And no, I've been working on that Khashoggi show for a year, and it is going to happen. I have not forgotten it at all. As a matter of fact, it keeps coming up, even in this show, the research around this one. Stefan, it's great to see you. And we saw Kate out there. Fantastic to see you. And also, I wanted to shout out to Groovy Bean. And who else we got? Pono. Brenda Fisher, thanks so much. We will be back next Friday with X Series episode 78. And we're going to be going pretty deep on that one. You don't want to miss it. Mark it on your calendar. And also make sure that you do sign up for the newsletter, as I suggested during the program, because, look, I mean, the thing is, with what we've been having go on with the social media networks, they just are not reliable. And so we have to have that direct pipeline. Make sure that you do have that sign up for the newsletter. It is free. And like I said, you'll get it about once a week, just telling you what great shows we have coming up for you, incredible events coming for you, and guests and interviews you're not going to believe. So make sure that you're also a member of Dark Journalist. Subscribe. Tonight is an excellent time. and get behind the activity of the work we're doing here. We've made it real easy and affordable for you, and you're going to want to be a member. We're going to have amazing things coming up for you for 2020. And Miss Olivia?
I've got to thank some super chatters.
Yes.
Okay, so James Belch, Scabtree Scabby, Carol Casa, Jinx Jackson, Tim Travis, PRBR, Wide Awake, Charles Marlowe, Neil Hart, Data Relay, Maggie Smith, and Neurosurgery Highland. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We really appreciate your support for the show. And, it becomes more important than ever with the kind of work that we're doing. We will see you next week. And thanks so much for joining us, Miss Olivia. Outstanding. A round of applause for Miss Olivia. Just an incredible job.
Crazy tonight.
You did great with it and great questions. And we will see you all next week.
Thanks so much.
Terrific. And of course, I'm going to end the broadcast now, but it never really ends, as you know. It says end broadcast. Have a great night and a great weekend. And enjoy the eclipse.
And keep breathing. Stay calm.
And carry on.
Yeah, and carry on.